Section 1. The life of an assassin in the Dark Ages. Imagine for a moment that you are a medieval assassin. It's not as glamorous as it might seem in movies or stories. You've been trained in the deadly arts of stealth, swordsmanship, and strategy. But the reality of your profession is one of constant tension, discomfort, and isolation. You live on the fringes of society, dealing in secrets and shadows, doing the bidding of powerful men, or sometimes women who value your life only as long as you're useful. And despite all your training, you know that every day you wake up could be your life. In the early Middle Ages, the world was a dark and uncertain place. Kings, lords, and knights ruled over vast territories, and political intrigue was as common as battle. Assassins were often hired to eliminate threats to power, but this wasn't a job that offered any kind of comfort or long-term security. The life of an assassin was unpredictable and dangerous. You had to be quick, quiet, and efficient, otherwise, your career might end before it even started. The tools of your trade were as simple as they were effective. A small, sharp knife or poison might be all you needed to take down a target. And though you may have been trained in the ways of swordplay, much of an assassin's work was done under the cover of night, far from the battlefield. You didn't wear fancy armor or ride horses into battle. You wore simple, inconspicuous clothes and blended into crowds, knowing that, if discovered, your life would be worth less than a single coin to your employer. Your job wasn't just about eliminating your target. It also required you to navigate complex networks of informants, spies, and fellow criminals. Assassins often operated in small, secretive guilds, or as individuals hired by wealthy elites. Trust was hard to come by, especially in a world where betrayal was as common as swords at the ready. And with every job, you risked not just your life, but your very soul at least. As far as the church was concerned, the medieval church, with its strict doctrine, often viewed assassination as a mortal sin, a breach of divine law. Many assassins worked in secret to avoid the wrath of the church, knowing that being caught could result in not just excommunication, but also violent retribution from religious authorities. The tension between surviving your profession and avoiding the heavy hand of the church was just another part of your daily life. You also had little control over the morality of your assignments. Some assassins worked for nobles or kings who wanted to eliminate rivals, while others were hired to deal with enemies of the state or individuals suspected of treason. Whatever the cause, it wasn't your job to ask questions. You did as you were told, because that's how you survived. Your honor was often at odds with your survival instinct, so you became desensitized to the killing. The more you worked, the more you realized that the only thing you had left was your skills and your ability to stay hidden, both physically and mentally. The struggles of hidden work. As a medieval assassin, the dangers you faced weren't just physical, they were psychological. Your very existence depended on secrecy. You didn't wear a uniform, nor did you carry a banner proclaiming your allegiance. You were a ghost, existing only as long as you remained undetected. And while there might have been some satisfaction in your work, the constant anxiety of being exposed weighed heavily on you. The fact that your entire career could vanish in an instant, often at the hands of those you trusted most, was an ever-present reality. Living a life of secrecy meant a constant need to avoid suspicion, blending into the crowds, remaining inconspicuous. Whether you worked for a noble family, a political faction, or even as a free agent, you had to ensure that no one ever learned your true purpose. Simple tasks, like visiting the market, talking to strangers, or even socializing with peers became fraught with danger. The moment you revealed too much of yourself, the risk of being discovered grew exponentially. The job wasn't a consistent affair either. While some assassins were employed by monarchs or nobles, others had to make do with more irregular and less prestigious contracts. You had to adapt to the circumstances at hand, often working on the margins of society. Sometimes the work involved infiltrating enemies or getting close to high-ranking individuals, only to strike when the time was right. But the fact that such high-profile kills required impeccable timing meant that you spent most of your time waiting for the right moment to strike, or for a new contract to appear. In between assignments, you were essentially left to your own devices, which often meant periods of relative boredom and anxiety. And with few legitimate avenues to make a living, Most assassins resorted to working as spies, thieves, or mercenaries to make ends meet. The line between assassin and criminal was often blurred, and your reputation was key. If you failed at one job, it wasn't just the monetary loss you had to fear, it was the loss of your reputation. Fail once, and your effectiveness would be compromised. The more you failed, the more difficult it became to find future work, and the less likely you were to survive. You also had to deal with a society that wasn't entirely sympathetic to your profession. While assassination was occasionally seen as a necessary evil in a world full of political strife, it was rarely glamorous. Assassins were not revered heroes. Instead, they were often regarded with suspicion and contempt. Your work required a careful balance of skill and discretion, and many found it difficult to reconcile the necessity of your job with their moral compass. Even your clients, the nobles and leaders who employed you, had little regard for your well-being once the job was complete. You were nothing more than a tool to them, disposable once your utility had ended. In fact, even when your work was successful, it was rarely celebrated publicly. You were a shadow in the background, a fleeting figure who quickly disappeared after the deed was done. The glory typically went to those who commissioned you, not to you, the one who took the life. So when you completed a mission, it was often followed by another round of hiding, staying out of sight, and remaining unnoticed. Your identity was as malleable as the shadows you hid in. Then there was the moral and psychological toll that came with the profession. Assassination isn't like fighting on the battlefield, where you can tell yourself that the war is justified or that you're just following orders. Here you killed on command, with no real moral justification other than the one given to you by your employer. Over time, this could erode your sense of self. The more people you eliminated, the more difficult it became to separate yourself from the act. Were you simply a tool, executing someone else's will? Or did you begin to believe in the righteousness of your work? The longer you stayed in this profession, the more blurred the line between right and wrong became, until it seemed that survival itself was the only thing that mattered. Your work as an assassin meant constant emotional turmoil. You couldn't afford to care for the victims, whether they were hated political rivals or innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. Killing became routine, but the emotional weight never fully went away. No matter how many times you completed your mission, the inner conflict would linger. Yet this was your life now, and any attempt to retreat from it would mean poverty or worse. In addition to these personal struggles, there was always the constant fear of betrayal. Fellow assassins or mercenaries who once worked with you in the shadows could easily turn on you. The rewards of betrayal were high. If you were caught or your mission failed, your employer had little reason to keep you alive. It was a cutthroat world, and trust was in short supply. What would you do if betrayal came from those closest to you? Could you survive the inevitable moment of reckoning, when your own past actions caught up with you? The final price of a deadly profession. The nature of your job meant that you could never truly trust anyone, not even your clients. Your existence depended entirely on being useful to those in power. But once you had outlived that usefulness, you were expendable. The world you operated in was a dangerous one, and it wasn't just your enemies who wanted you dead. It was the very people who had hired you. The constant threat of betrayal, coupled with the knowledge that your work was never fully appreciated, wore down on you over time. The medieval assassin was both a shadow and a ghost. You existed to serve, and your life was based on a series of small, secretive actions, none of which allowed you to form long-term relationships or find any semblance of peace. Your existence was built on a precarious balance between success and failure, and more often than not, failure was a death sentence. As you got older, you began to see the cost of your profession. It wasn't just the possibility of being caught and executed, it was the toll on your psyche. The act of killing over and over again, often with little emotional attachment to the victims, led to a kind of moral corrosion. The more people you killed, the less you could remember who you once were. The lines between right and wrong, between human beings and targets, became more and more difficult to discern. And then, there was the physical toll. Being an assassin required constant vigilance, always being prepared for an escape, always being on the lookout for those who might want revenge, always knowing that one misstep could cost you your life. The constant strain of being at the edge of danger left little room for relaxation, for peace of mind. Many assassins, even if they survived the profession for years, were often plagued by insomnia, anxiety, or the constant feeling that they were being hunted. At the same time, you could never escape the grim reality that the very act of assassination could come back to haunt you in ways you never expected. You might have killed someone in service of your employer, but if your employer was overthrown, if the political tides shifted, you might find yourself being hunted down just as ruthlessly as the person you had eliminated. The assassin's world was one where trust was fleeting, and alliances were only as strong as the next paymaster. The fear of being caught in the crosshairs of revenge was a constant companion. Assassins often operated in guilds or networks of like-minded individuals, and if a job went wrong, if an assassination failed or the wrong person was killed, the consequences could be deadly. Not only would the enemy seek you out, but your own guild or employer might turn on you, blaming you for the failure. The job was as much about survival within the network of criminals as it was about the physical act of killing. The harsh reality was that the medieval assassin's life was almost always short. Few managed to live long enough to retire. Many died young, either in the line of duty or due to betrayal. The lifestyle was one of constant flux, where only the most skilled at navigating danger and deception could survive. For the majority of assassins, the price of this profession was steep. Emotional desolation, the constant threat of death, and the knowledge that their work, no matter how successful, would always leave them isolated and vulnerable. And if you did survive, and if you made it out of the profession, you would find yourself wondering what was left. The skills you had honed over years of dangerous work, stealth, strategy, deception, had no place in ordinary society. Your past, filled with violence and secrecy, left you with few options. Even if you managed to build a new life, the weight of what you had done would never leave you. The assassin's life was a paradox. It required you to be ruthless, and yet in the end, left you with nothing but regret. As the world around you continued to turn, you would be left to ask yourself, was it worth it? Did the price you paid, both physically and psychologically, justify the work you did for others? And how could you ever truly escape the shadows that followed you? The Great Plague, Europe's silent killer, the spread and fear. The 14th century was a time of relative peace and prosperity in parts of Europe, but this period would soon be overshadowed by one of the most devastating events in human history, the Great Plague, also known as the Black Death. The arrival of this disease in Europe, in the year 1347, marked the beginning of a period of unimaginable loss, fear, and upheaval. The plague would kill an estimated 25 to 30 million people, roughly a third of Europe's population, in just a few short years. It was not just a physical disaster, but also a social, economic, and psychological one that would alter the course of European history forever. The plague's origins are still debated, but it is widely believed to have been caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was spread by fleas living on rats. The disease likely began in Central Asia, where it was carried along trade routes, particularly the Silk Road, into the Mediterranean. The Genoese traders, who had strong commercial ties with the East, unknowingly brought the plague with them when they returned to Europe from the East, carrying rats and fleas that were infected. By the time the first cases appeared in Sicily in 1347, the plague had already spread across large swaths of Europe. The speed of the disease's spread was unprecedented. Within months, the plague had spread through Italy and France, before devastating England, Spain, and the rest of Europe. Cities with dense populations were particularly hard hit, and the death toll in major urban centers was staggering. In some cases, entire towns were wiped out in a matter of weeks. The disease killed indiscriminately, affecting both the rich and the poor, the young and the old. No one was safe from the Black Death. The symptoms of the plague were terrifying. The most common form of the disease was bubonic plague, which caused fever, chills, headaches, and the sudden appearance of painful swollen lymph nodes, or bobeas, often in the groin, armpit, or neck. This form of the disease was often fatal within days, as the bacteria rapidly spread through the bloodstream, causing septicemia and organ failure. Other forms of the plague, such as pneumonic plague, were even more deadly, as they could spread through the air via coughing and sneezing, infecting entire households at once. The mere presence of a victim in the early stages of the disease sent fear rippling through the population. The speed at which the disease took hold was both horrifying and baffling. One moment a person might appear healthy, and in the next they could be dead, their body ravaged by the fever and swelling. Death, once a slow and natural process, had become swift and brutal. The fear and anxiety the disease induced were unlike anything the people of Europe had ever experienced. As the plague spread, people began to panic. They turned to various explanations for the outbreak, from religious punishment to astrological misalignments. The Church, at the time the most influential institution in Europe, claimed that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, though they could not explain why the righteous suffered as much as the sinners. In response to the growing panic, towns and cities took extreme measures to contain the disease. Many people fled their homes, abandoning loved ones, and even their possessions in an effort to escape the plague. The wealthiest were able to afford to escape to isolated estates, but for the poor, there was no escape. Entire families were wiped out, and in many places, there were not enough people left to bury the dead. The sight of dead bodies lying in the streets became all too common. Some people, in a desperate attempt to stave off the plague, resorted to increasingly bizarre and ineffective remedies. Flagellants. A group of religious zealots roamed the streets, whipping themselves in a form of self-punishment, believing that this would atone for their sins and spare them from the plague. Others turned to magic, potions and superstitions, hoping that these would protect them from the unseen forces wreaking havoc on their lives. Despite these efforts, the plague spread unchecked. The nature of the disease meant that no one was immune, and there was no real understanding of how it was transmitted. It was only much later that the true causes of the Black Death were understood. Centuries after the devastation had passed, the horror of the Black Death was compounded by the social disintegration it caused. In many places, the plague led to a breakdown in societal norms and structures. Trade routes were disrupted, markets emptied, and the economic system began to collapse. There were simply not enough people left to work the land, run the shops, or maintain the infrastructure that had supported life before the outbreak. The once flourishing cities began to crumble, and the countryside saw its own share of devastation. The plague's impact on Europe was so profound that the social and political structures that had been in place before the Black Death would never be the same. The fear and chaos that spread as a result of the plague led to a breakdown of trust in institutions. People turned inward, focusing on survival rather than the communal concerns that had once bound society together. The widespread deaths caused a massive labor shortage, and this shortage began to shift the balance of power between workers and their employers. Those who survived found that they were suddenly in higher demand, and they could demand better wages and working conditions. However, as the immediate effects of the plague began to subside, the question arose, would Europe ever return to normal? Would the ravaged societies rebuild? And how would they recover from such unimaginable loss? The unseen costs of disease. As the Black Death ravaged Europe, the immediate effects were undeniably catastrophic. Cities crumbled, fields went untended, and entire communities were decimated. Yet, beneath the surface of this environmental and economic collapse lay the far-reaching, less visible consequences of the plague, many of which would shape European society for generations. The disease didn't just kill people, it reshaped entire systems of power, economics and culture. The economic impact. The collapse of medieval Europe's economy. The most immediate economic consequence of the Black Death was the drastic reduction in the workforce. With so many people dying, from peasants to merchants, craftsmen to clergy, the available labor pool shrank to a fraction of what it had been. Fields went unplanted, trade routes were disrupted, and whole towns saw their populations fall to dangerous levels. Economic systems that had been in place for centuries struggled to adapt to this new, devastated world. For the survivors, however, the labor shortage created an unexpected shift in power dynamics. As the demand for workers skyrocketed, many of the surviving peasants were able to negotiate better wages. Landlords and nobles who had once held significant power over their laborers suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage. There were simply fewer people available to work the land, and as a result, peasants gained leverage in labor contracts. This shift in power led to some positive changes for the working class, but it also resulted in tension. Wealthy landowners, eager to protect their estates and income, often resisted paying higher wages. In some regions, this resulted in uprisings, as peasants demanded more control over their labor. These uprisings, such as the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, became a focal point in the struggle between the lower classes and the aristocracy. Though these revolts were often crushed, they signaled the beginning of a long-standing resentment between the nobility and the newly empowered lower classes. In addition to the labor shifts, the plague also disrupted trade. Markets once bustling with goods and activity became empty as merchants died off or retreated in fear of the disease. Ports that had once been major centers of trade saw their shipping lanes closed down. The interruptions in trade led to the collapse of local economies, especially in cities that relied heavily on commerce, such as Florence and Venice. The wealth of European cities like these, once built on trade and banking, became unstable. However, the economic landscape wasn't entirely bleak. With fewer people to work the land, agricultural practices began to change. The surviving workers now had more land available to cultivate, and this resulted in higher wages for those who remained. In the long term, Europe began to experience a new agricultural structure, with an increased focus on productivity in the fields. Social consequences. A breakdown in social order. In addition to the economic strain caused by the Black Death, the disease also led to a profound breakdown in social order. As the body count mounted and the plague spread unchecked across Europe, many people turned inward, seeking solace in religion or superstition. The fear of the disease and the accompanying social chaos led to shifts in people's perceptions of authority, religion, and even their sense of community. The church, which had once been a unifying force in medieval Europe, found itself in crisis. As the death toll mounted, many people began to question the church's ability to protect them from the plague. Priests and bishops, just as vulnerable as anyone else, died at alarming rate. This left the church in disarray, unable to provide the spiritual support that people had once relied upon. Moreover, many began to see the plague as a divine punishment, a sign of God's anger. This fear led some to take extreme measures, such as the rise of the flagellants. These self-flagellating groups roamed Europe, whipping themselves in public as a form of penance for the sins they believed had caused the plague. This surge in religious fervor was met with mixed responses from the church. While some church leaders denounced the flagellants as heretics, others saw their actions as a form of sincere repentance. Despite their fervent belief in their cause, the flagellants ultimately failed to stop the plague. At the same time, some people turned to more superstitious means of protection. In some areas, people blamed Jews for the spread of the disease, claiming they had poisoned wells or spread the disease intentionally. This led to widespread anti-Semitic violence, with Jewish communities across Europe being attacked and massacred. In some places, entire Jewish populations were burned alive and their properties were looted. This wave of hatred was not only fueled by fear, but also by deep-seated religious and racial prejudice. The pogroms that ensued further fractured European society, adding to the chaos and division caused by the plague. As fear and confusion swept through the populace, social cohesion began to deteriorate. Towns and villages became more insular, as people retreated from one another. Families were separated, as many abandoned their sick relatives in the hopes of escaping the disease. People began to view each other, not as fellow humans but as potential threats, carriers of the plague. Trust in others eroded, and this distrust extended to both the elites and the common people. The Black Death also exposed the limitations of medieval medical practices. Without an understanding of how diseases were spread, treatments were often ineffective or harmful. Many doctors resorted to crude remedies, such as bloodletting or the use of herbal potions, while others simply abandoned their patients. The failure of medieval medicine added to the sense of helplessness and fear, as people turned to religion, superstition, and even more extreme measures to combat the disease. The psychological toll, a generation marked by trauma. The psychological impact of the Black Death on the survivors cannot be underestimated. The constant fear of death, the loss of loved ones, and the collapse of the social order left a deep scar on Europe's collective psyche. People had witnessed entire families die in the span of a few days. They had watched as their villages were wiped off the map, and cities turned into ghost towns. The trauma of the plague marked an entire generation, leaving behind a sense of hopelessness and despair that would last for years. People found it difficult to comprehend the scale of the devastation they had experienced. The psychological toll of living through such a catastrophic event led many to view life as fleeting and fragile, and it shaped the way people lived in the decades that followed. In the years after the plague, Europe was a different place. The sense of communal living that had once been a staple of medieval society began to fade. People became more individualistic, and the fear of death led to a focus on personal survival rather than communal well-being. There was also a noticeable shift in the arts and culture. The horrific images of death and decay during the plague would influence painters, poets, and thinkers for generations. The themes of death, mortality, and the fragility of life became central to European art and literature in the aftermath of the Black Death. While society was slowly rebuilding itself, it was clear that the plague had irrevocably changed the social fabric of Europe. How could the survivors ever return to the way things were before? How would they rebuild a society shattered by so much loss? Aftermath and recovery. The Black Death left a mark on Europe that would take centuries to fully recover from. Though the plague itself eventually subsided, its aftermath reverberated across the continent, shaping everything from politics to culture, economics to religion. It led to the slow but inevitable restructuring of European society, a world scarred by death and loss. But as the plague faded, so did the old structures of power, and what emerged was a new world, one shaped by necessity, survival, and the lessons learned from years of suffering, economic rebirth and social change. While the immediate effects of the plague were devastating, the long-term economic consequences played a significant role in reshaping Europe. With the death of approximately a third of the population, the survivors found themselves in a vastly different world. The labor shortage created by the decimation of the population gave the working classes, peasants, artisans, and laborers an unexpected advantage. For centuries, these groups had lived under the thumb of the nobility, forced to work the land under feudal systems that limited their mobility and income. Now, with fewer people to work the land, the surviving peasants and workers found that they had the power to demand higher wages. In some regions, the price of labor nearly doubled as landowners were forced to negotiate better terms for their workers. Many peasants who had once been bound to the land found themselves able to purchase land or better housing, and this led to a small but significant rise in the living standards of the lower classes. However, the nobility did not give up their power easily. Landowners and rulers responded to the growing demands of the laboring class with resistance. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was one such example, where workers in England, already struggling with the aftermath of the plague, rose up against the feudal system, demanding fair wages and better living conditions. While the revolt was ultimately crushed, it highlighted the growing tension between the upper and lower classes, which would continue to influence social dynamics for centuries. Economically, the devastation of the plague also created opportunities for those who survived. With the collapse of old trade routes and the disruption of agriculture, the survivors had to rebuild from the ground up. New agricultural techniques and crop rotations were introduced, allowing the land to recover, and the surviving population began to cultivate the land more efficiently than before. The labor force, though reduced, was now better compensated, and had a more significant role in shaping the economy than ever before. The shift in labor dynamics also contributed to the gradual decline of feudalism. The plague disrupted the traditional structure of the medieval manor system, weakening the hold of the nobility over their peasants. As wages increased and peasants gained more freedom, the foundations of feudal society began to crumble. This shift set the stage for the rise of early capitalism in Europe, where market forces and trade began to play a more significant role in shaping society. Religious Reformation. A crisis of faith. The religious upheaval caused by the Black Death cannot be overstated. As the plague spread and took so many lives, the Church, which had long been viewed as the spiritual authority of Europe, found itself at the center of a crisis of faith. The Church had long claimed to have the answers to life's most profound questions: how to live, how to die, and what awaited after death. But when the plague struck, even the most devout found themselves questioning the Church's ability to protect them. The idea that the plague was a punishment from God gained traction, leading to a surge in religious fervor. People flocked to monasteries and churches in an attempt to repent for their sins and beg for mercy. Some, like the flagellants, engaged in self-flagellation as a form of penance, believing that whipping themselves would absolve them of sin and save them from the plague. But despite their efforts, the plague continued to spread with devastating speed. The death toll climbed higher, and the Church's failure to protect its followers only served to erode its authority. As the plague waned and the immediate crisis subsided, many began to question the church's teachings and practices. Some turned away from religious rituals altogether, disillusioned by the church's inability to provide answers or protection. Others, particularly in cities, began to seek new religious and philosophical perspectives, opening the door to the ideas that would later fuel the Renaissance and eventually the Reformation. In the wake of the plague, a series of religious reforms began to take shape, particularly within the Catholic Church. New movements, such as the Lollards in England, began to call for changes to church practices, criticizing its wealth, corruption and authority. These movements, while small at first, would grow in the coming centuries and eventually give rise to figures like Martin Luther, who would challenge the church's authority during the Reformation. The plague had created a spiritual crisis, but it also laid the groundwork for the religious and intellectual revolutions that would follow. The survivors of the Black Death were left with an altered view of religion, one that would shape the course of European history for generations. Cultural shifts, art, literature, and a new world view. The Black Death also had a profound effect on European culture. The widespread death and suffering experienced during the plague led to a darker, more somber worldview, which was reflected in the art and literature of the time. Artists began to depict death and decay in more visceral ways, capturing the terrifying reality of the plague. The danse macabre, or dance of death, a popular motif in medieval art, became widespread during this period. It depicted skeletons or figures of death leading people, young and old, rich and poor, toward their inevitable end. The image of death was no longer distant or abstract, but a constant presence in daily life. The plague also left its mark on literature. Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio, in his work The Decameron, explored the societal effects of the plague. In his stories, he painted a picture of a world in which life had become unpredictable and fragile. His characters, escaping the ravages of the plague, tell stories of love, betrayal, and misfortune, reflecting the uncertain future that lay ahead for survivors. The themes of mortality and the fleeting nature of life permeated much of the literature of the time, and these ideas would shape the intellectual landscape of the Renaissance. In the long term, the trauma caused by the plague contributed to the emergence of humanism. With so many lives lost, and a culture still recovering from the horrors of the Black Death, a new appreciation for human life and individual agency began to take hold. The Renaissance, which blossomed in the following centuries, was in part a response to the existential questions raised by the plague. In an era where so much had been lost, people began to look to the human experience for meaning, rather than relying solely on the afterlife. The plague's legacy, a changing Europe. While Europe eventually recovered from the immediate devastation of the Black Death, the societal and cultural shifts caused by the plague would continue to influence European history for centuries. The labor changes, the rise of early capitalism, and the weakening of feudalism were all key developments that would contribute to the formation of modern European society. The religious and intellectual movements that emerged in the wake of the plague played a crucial role in shaping the course of European thought, leading to the Reformation and the Renaissance. The decline of the Church's dominance in the lives of ordinary people also opened the door for new ideas, philosophies, and a more secular worldview that would define the early modern period. The Black Death, then, was not just a disease, it was a catalyst for transformation. It reshaped the economic, political, and cultural landscape of Europe, marking the end of an era and the beginning of another. Its legacy is seen not only in the immediate changes it brought, but in the long-term shifts that set the stage for the modern world. The Black Death teaches us about resilience in the face of unimaginable loss, and about how societies can rebuild, adapt, and transform in response to disaster. How many societies, even today, might find themselves testing the same resilience in the face of new, unpredictable challenges? The fall of Constantinople. The final days of a Byzantine Empire. The rise and glory of Constantinople. Constantinople, known today as Istanbul, was the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, and one of the most strategically important cities in the world. Founded by Emperor Constantine the Great in 330 AD, it stood at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, a city that bridged both cultures and continents. The city was a thriving hub of commerce, culture, and religion, and it played a pivotal role in the history of both the Roman Empire and the Christian world. Its beauty, grandeur, and significance made it one of the most admired cities in the world. For over a millennium, Constantinople served as the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and its defences, particularly the legendary walls that surrounded the city, made it nearly impregnable. The city's position on the Bosporus Strait meant that it controlled access to both the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, making it a crucial trading post and a centre of cultural exchange between East and West. In its prime, Constantinople was one of the most sophisticated cities in the world, a beacon of learning, architecture, and religion. At the heart of the city stood the Hagia Sophia, a magnificent cathedral that was a symbol of Byzantine religious and architectural achievement. The Byzantine emperors, who ruled from Constantinople, saw themselves as the inheritors of the Roman Empire and the defenders of Christianity. The city was not just a political capital, it was also a spiritual centre for the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Patriarch of Constantinople was one of the most important figures in the Christian world. Constantinople was also a cultural and intellectual powerhouse. It housed vast libraries of ancient texts, many of which had been preserved by the Byzantines while much of the Western Roman Empire had fallen into the Dark Ages. The city was home to scholars, artists, and philosophers who kept the flame of classical learning alive during times when Europe was in turmoil. Constantinople's artistic achievements were equally remarkable, particularly its mosaics, which adorned the walls of churches and palaces, depicting scenes from the Bible and the lives of the saints in brilliant colours and intricate detail. The Byzantine Empire itself, though smaller and weaker than its Roman predecessor, remained a significant force in world affairs throughout the Middle Ages. The empire's military and diplomatic influence reached across the Mediterranean, and it was a bastion of Christianity against the spread of Islam, which had swept across much of the Middle East and North Africa. Despite its glory, however, the Byzantine Empire was in decline by the 15th. The empire had been steadily losing territory to the Ottoman Turks, a rising Muslim power in Asia Minor. The city of Constantinople, once a thriving metropolis and a symbol of imperial might, now found itself surrounded by enemies on all sides. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by internal strife, corruption, and external invasions, was on the brink of collapse. Its resources were depleted, its military stretched thin, and its ability to defend itself severely compromised. By the early 1400s, Constantinople had become an isolated and vulnerable city. The Ottoman Empire, led by the ambitious and military genius Sultan Mehmed II, was steadily encroaching on Byzantine territory. It was clear to everyone, including the rulers of Constantinople, that the city's days were numbered. The Byzantine emperor, Constantine Elephant Palaiologos, could only watch as the Ottomans, under Mehmed's leadership, gathered their forces for an inevitable siege. The stage was set for one of the most momentous events in world history, the fall of Constantinople. Section 2. The Siege and the Slow Collapse. By 1453, the situation for Constantinople had become dire. The Byzantine Empire was a mere shadow of its former self, its territories shrinking rapidly in the face of Ottoman expansion. The city itself was surrounded by the encroaching Ottoman Empire, which had already conquered much of Asia Minor, the Balkans, and Greece. The last remnants of Byzantine power rested within the city's walls, and its survival seemed uncertain at best. The man responsible for leading the charge against Constantinople was Sultan Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror. He was a young and ambitious leader who had ascended to the throne of the Ottoman Empire at just 19 years old. Determined to add Constantinople to his growing empire, Mehmed meticulously planned the siege, aware that capturing this legendary city would not only cement his status as one of the greatest Ottoman sultans, but also give him control over vital trade routes between Europe and Asia. Mehmed's forces were massive, reportedly numbering between 80,000 and 100,000 soldiers, including elite Janissary troops, archers and engineers. This was a far larger force than the 7,000 defenders of Constantinople, which included Byzantine soldiers, local mercenaries, and a small contingent of foreign allies. The disparity in numbers was staggering, and the odds were clearly against the defenders. The siege of Constantinople began on April 6, 1453, with Mehmed's army surrounding the city on land and sea. Constantinople's famous defensive walls, which had withstood numerous sieges over the centuries, were now facing their greatest challenge. The city's position on the Bosporus Strait made it strategically important, but also vulnerable. It was essentially an island, surrounded by water on three sides, with only the landward side protected by the impressive walls that had been built during the reign of Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century. The walls of Constantinople had been the pride of the Byzantines for centuries. They were massive, built with huge blocks of stone and reinforced with towers and gates. But while these fortifications had once been seen as impenetrable, they had weaknesses. The walls, though strong, were outdated and unable to withstand the powerful artillery that Mehmed brought with him. The Byzantine defenders were also severely outnumbered and lacked the military resources to hold off the Ottomans for long. Mehmed, however, was not merely relying on his overwhelming numbers. He had brought with him a new weapon, massive cannons, that could fire enormous projectiles capable of breaching the city's ancient walls. These cannons, which had never been seen before in Europe, were a technological marvel of their time. The largest of these cannons was so huge that it required a team of men just to move it into position. With these weapons, Mehmed was able to lay siege to Constantinople in a way that had never been done before. The siege lasted for weeks, with the Ottomans relentlessly bombarding the city's walls. As the days passed, the defenders of Constantinople fought back fiercely, but they were hampered by a lack of resources. The Byzantine defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI and Palaeologus, did everything they could to protect the city. Constantine was a competent and determined leader, but he was fighting a losing battle. His attempts to secure reinforcements from the west were largely unsuccessful. Despite the desperate pleas for help, the European powers, still reeling from the 100 Years' War and dealing with their own internal issues, were largely uninterested in aiding the Byzantines. The city's defenders could only hold out for so long. The Ottomans' artillery caused massive damage to the walls, and Mehmed's army began to breach them. But even as the walls fell and the Ottomans closed in, the defenders never gave up. The final days of the siege were marked by heroic, though ultimately futile, attempts to defend the city. In the face of such overwhelming force, the Byzantine soldiers fought with courage, knowing that their survival depended on the success of their final stand. The Ottomans, however, were relentless. By May 22, 1453, the situation was dire for the defenders of Constantinople. The walls had been breached, and Mehmed's army was poised to launch a final assault on the city. The Byzantines, despite their bravery, were exhausted and demoralized. The city's food supplies were running low, and the arrival of reinforcements from the west, which had been promised, never materialized. As the defenders looked out over the battlefield, they knew that the end was near. The final assault came on the night of May. The Ottomans, having broken through the walls, swarmed into the city. The defenders, though outnumbered and exhausted, fought valiantly. Emperor Constantine XI, realizing that the city was lost, led the charge against the Ottomans, fighting to the very end. He was last seen on the walls, sword in hand, fighting to the death. His body was never found, and it is believed that he died in the final hours of the battle. As the Ottomans poured into the city, the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire were crushed. Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire, and with it, the Byzantine Empire came to an end. The city was plundered, its churches turned into mosques, and its treasures looted. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of one of the longest and most significant civilizations in history, and the rise of a new world order in the Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire now controlled Constantinople, and Mehmed the Conqueror would go on to become one of history's most famous rulers. He solidified his position as the ruler of both the Christian and Muslim worlds, turning Constantinople into the capital of the Ottoman Empire and renaming it Istanbul. The fall of Constantinople had lasting implications for both the East and the West, influencing the course of European history, trade and exploration for centuries to come. Yet, as the Ottomans celebrated their victory, the question remained: what would become of the survivors of Constantinople, the last heirs of the Byzantine Empire? And how would the West respond to the loss of a city that had been the cradle of Christianity and civilization for over 1,000 years? A new empire in its wake. The fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, was not only a decisive moment for the Byzantine Empire, but also the beginning of a new era for the Ottoman Empire and the wider world. The city's capture was a landmark event, marking the end of one civilization and the rise of another. As Constantinople became Istanbul under Ottoman rule, the effects of the conquest rippled across Europe, Asia and Africa, fundamentally altering the political, religious and cultural landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. The aftermath for Constantinople and its people. For the people of Constantinople, the aftermath of the Ottoman conquest was catastrophic. The city, which had stood as the capital of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years, was plundered. The Ottomans, having laid siege to the city for weeks, flooded in, looting its treasures and desecrating its churches. The Hagia Sophia, the most revered cathedral in the Byzantine world, was converted into a mosque. Its magnificent Christian mosaics were either covered up or destroyed, and the building became a symbol of the Ottomans' conquest. While many of the city's inhabitants were slaughtered during the siege, others were taken as prisoners or forced into slavery. Many of the surviving Christian residents of Constantinople were given the choice to convert to Islam or face execution. Those who remained Christian were allowed to practice their faith, but under the strict supervision of the new Ottoman rulers. The city's vibrant Christian population, which had once dominated the cultural and religious life of Constantinople, was now reduced to a minority, with Islam becoming the dominant religion. The conquest of Constantinople also marked the end of the Byzantine Empire's political authority, leaving the remnants of the empire scattered across smaller territories in the Balkans and Greece. The capture of the city by the Ottomans effectively ended the last vestiges of Roman rule, and it is often considered the final blow to the classical Roman Empire. The loss of Constantinople was a huge blow to Western Christendom, as the city had long been a key center of Orthodox Christianity and a symbol of the defense against Islamic expansion into Europe. The rise of the Ottoman Empire. The fall of Constantinople was, however, a major triumph for the Ottoman Empire, cementing its position as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Mehmed II, now known as Mehmed the Conqueror, was hailed as one of history's greatest military leaders. The conquest of Constantinople not only expanded Ottoman territory, but also opened the doors to a wealth of knowledge, culture and trade that had been controlled by the Byzantine Empire. Mehmed's decision to turn Constantinople into the capital of the Ottoman Empire was symbolic. It was not just about controlling a strategically important city, it was about solidifying the Ottoman claim to be the rightful heirs of both the Roman and Byzantine legacies. By making Constantinople the new heart of his empire, Mehmed secured his place in history as the leader who brought the once mighty city under Ottoman rule. The Ottomans wasted no time in rebuilding Constantinople and making it the thriving center of the empire. Mehmed's efforts to revitalize the city included the construction of new mosques, markets and public buildings. The Hagia Sophia was turned into a mosque, and new religious and educational institutions were established. The Ottoman sultans, as well as their court, took great care to maintain and enhance the cultural and intellectual heritage of the city, blending Islamic, Byzantine and Roman influences into a unique Ottoman identity. Constantinople's strategic location continued to make it a vital center of trade and culture. The Ottomans used their control of the city to dominate trade routes between Europe and Asia, strengthening their economic and military power. The Ottomans also controlled the Bosporus Strait, one of the world's most important waterways, allowing them to control the flow of goods and people between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. In the wake of the conquest, the Ottoman Empire expanded rapidly. Mehmed's reign was marked by a series of military campaigns that extended Ottoman territory into the Balkans, Anatolia, and parts of North Africa. By the time of Mehmed's death in 1481, the Ottoman Empire had become one of the most powerful empires in the world, rivaling the European powers of the time. The impact on Europe. The ripple effects of the fall. The fall of Constantinople had profound consequences for Europe, especially in terms of trade and exploration. For centuries, Constantinople had been a key trading hub, connecting the east and west through the Silk Road and maritime routes. The Ottomans' control of the city meant that European merchants and traders could no longer access the lucrative markets of Asia through Constantinople. This disruption in trade caused significant economic problems in Western Europe, as the flow of goods such as spices, silk, and precious metals slowed down. In response to this, European nations began searching for alternative routes to Asia. The Portuguese, led by Prince Henry the Navigator, began to explore the west coast of Africa in search of a sea route to India. The Spanish, led by Christopher Columbus, embarked on their famous voyage across the Atlantic, eventually discovering the Americas. The search for new trade routes, sparked by the fall of Constantinople, marked the beginning of the Age of Exploration, a period that would dramatically alter the course of world history. The fall of Constantinople also had significant religious consequences. The city had long been the heart of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and its loss to the Ottomans dealt a blow to the Christian world. The Orthodox Church, though still maintaining a presence in the Ottoman Empire, was now subject to Ottoman control. The Ottomans allowed Orthodox Christians to continue practicing their faith, but they were now part of the millet system, a system that organized religious communities in the empire and gave them a degree of autonomy. However, this also meant that the Orthodox Church's political and cultural power was diminished. In the West, the loss of Constantinople to the Ottomans heightened fears of Ottoman expansion into Europe. The Ottomans continued their push into Europe, conquering much of the Balkans and laying siege to Vienna in 1529. This prompted the formation of alliances between European states to resist Ottoman encroachment. The fear of Ottoman dominance in Europe played a significant role in shaping European politics for the next several centuries, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries. The legacy of Constantinople's fall, a new world order. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of an era, the end of the Byzantine Empire, the end of Roman rule, and the end of a long chapter in European history. But it also marked the beginning of a new world order. The Ottoman Empire, with Constantinople as its capital, became a dominant force in the Mediterranean and beyond. The Ottomans would continue to expand, becoming one of the most powerful empires in the world for centuries. The conquest of Constantinople also shifted the balance of power in Europe, sparking the age of exploration and the eventual colonization of the Americas. The disruptions caused by the Ottomans' control of Constantinople led to new trade routes, new encounters between cultures, and the exchange of knowledge that would shape the modern world. For the people of Constantinople, the city would never be the same again. Once the proud capital of the Byzantine Empire, it became the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a city where the legacies of Rome, Byzantium and Islam intertwined. While the Byzantines had once preserved the ancient knowledge of the Greeks and Romans, the Ottomans would go on to preserve and build upon that knowledge, shaping the intellectual and cultural life of the empire for centuries. As we look back on the fall of Constantinople, we must ask ourselves, how did the loss of this ancient city, a city that had stood as a beacon of civilization for over 1,000 years, shape the world we live in today? And how did its fall set in motion the events that would eventually lead to the rise of modern Europe and the modern world? The invention of the printing press, how one device changed the world. As the state of knowledge before the press. Before the invention of the printing press, knowledge in Europe was passed along slowly and painstakingly. Books were scarce, expensive and laboriously hand-copied by scribes, often in monastic scriptoriums. This process was slow, and a single book could take months to produce. The scarcity of books meant that access to knowledge was limited to the wealthy elite, clergy and university. For the vast majority of people, learning was restricted to oral traditions and religious teachings. The manuscript culture of medieval Europe was based on handwritten books. Every document, whether it was a Bible, scientific treatise, or legal code, had to be copied by hand. This practice ensured that only a small number of books were available for distribution, and even fewer people had access to them. The production of books was a slow, expensive process, with scribes often using parchment or vellum as the medium. These materials were costly, and the time required to copy texts meant that only the wealthy, such as kings, nobles, and monasteries, could afford to collect and preserve these rare works. The limited availability of books had a profound impact on the dissemination of knowledge. While the clergy controlled much of the learning in medieval Europe, the vast majority of people were illiterate, and access to educational opportunities was scarce. The Church, which was the central authority for intellectual and spiritual life, controlled much of the written word. In fact, the majority of books produced during this time were religious texts, particularly Bibles and works of theology. Latin was the language of scholarship, and it was reserved for the educated elite. For most people, the written word was inaccessible, and the transmission of knowledge remained a labor-intensive and slow process. In the 14th and 15th centuries, however, a number of factors began to shift the intellectual landscape of Europe. A growing interest in humanism, the study of classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, led to the discovery of lost works of antiquity. As universities expanded and trade routes opened up across Europe, the demand for books grew. There was a desire for more practical knowledge, such as scientific texts, legal codes, and even literature. This created a fertile ground for change, but without a system to produce books quickly and cheaply, the expansion of knowledge was still limited. At this point, books were so expensive that they remained the province of a very small, select group. If someone wanted a book, they had to commission a scribe to copy it by hand, and even then, the cost could be prohibitive. While there were some rudimentary forms of printing in Asia, such as woodblock printing, Europe was still reliant on the traditional methods of copying by hand. In the midst of this situation, a revolution was quietly brewing in the city of Mainz, Germany, a city on the Rhine River that would soon become home to the man who would change the world, Johannes Gutenberg. But before Gutenberg's invention, the idea of mass-producing books remained a dream. The time for that dream was near, and it would be the invention of the printing press that would make it a reality, forever altering the course of history. Gutenberg and his creation, Johannes Gutenberg, a relatively obscure goldsmith from Mainz, Germany, would become the name forever associated with the invention of the printing press. Born around 1400, little is known about his early life, but what is certain is that he became involved in the burgeoning world of printing technology at a time when Europe was ripe for change. Before Gutenberg's work, various forms of printing existed in other parts of the world. In China, woodblock printing had been used for centuries, and movable type printing had been developed in Korea. However, these methods were slow and costly, and the technology had not yet made its way to Europe. Gutenberg's true innovation came from his idea of using movable type, individual letters and characters that could be arranged and rearranged to print any text. In the early 1440s, Gutenberg set to work on developing a mechanical method for printing that would be faster and more efficient than anything that had come before. Gutenberg's press used a combination of metal movable type, oil-based ink, and a press mechanism based on a wine press. The use of metal type allowed for the mass production of individual letters, which could be reused over and over again to form different pages of text. This was a groundbreaking improvement over the existing woodblock printing, in which entire pages were carved by hand into blocks of wood and could only be used once. Gutenberg's method also involved the creation of a unique, durable type of ink that was oil-based as opposed to the water-based inks used in earlier printing. Oil-based ink adhered better to metal type and provided clearer, more consistent prints. This ink, combined with the movable type, was key to making printing more efficient and affordable. Gutenberg's printing press was not just a mechanical device, it was also a catalyst for profound social and intellectual changes. By making it possible to produce books quickly and in large quantities, Gutenberg's invention radically altered the accessibility of knowledge. His first major printing project was the Gutenberg Bible, a Latin edition of the Bible that he completed around. The Gutenberg Bible was a work of art as much as it was a technological achievement, with beautifully crafted type and ornate decorations. The Bible was revolutionary not only because it was the first major book printed with movable type, but also because it made the Bible accessible in a way it never had been before. For centuries, the Bible had been painstakingly copied by hand in monasteries, often in Latin, a language that few could read. By printing the Bible, Gutenberg opened the door for people to access sacred texts more widely. The spread of printed Bibles began to erode the monopoly that the Catholic Church had long held over religious knowledge. But Gutenberg's invention did more than just provide religious texts. It made it possible to mass-produce all kinds of books, texts that were previously unavailable, or prohibitively expensive. The printing press made it possible to print works on science, philosophy, law, literature, and history, among many others. This democratization of knowledge allowed information to spread more freely across Europe. Where once books had been rare and confined to monasteries and the courts of royalty, they could now be found in towns, cities, and universities across the continent. As the press spread throughout Europe, the effects were immediate and far-reaching. The printing press allowed ideas to circulate rapidly, breaking down the barriers of communication that had previously existed. Writers, scholars, and thinkers could now communicate with a much wider audience. The Protestant Reformation, for example, would not have been possible without the printing press. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, which challenged the practices of the Catholic Church, were printed and distributed widely, helping to ignite the Reformation. The spread of printed books also had a profound impact on education. Universities, which had once relied on hand-copied manuscripts for instruction, began to acquire printed books in greater numbers. Students and scholars could now access a much wider range of texts, which accelerated the spread of knowledge and learning across Europe. The printing press, in essence, laid the groundwork for the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution, as the rapid dissemination of new ideas became possible on an unprecedented scale. While Gutenberg's invention was revolutionary, it was not immediately embraced by all. The cost of printing presses and the initial difficulty in producing books meant that it took time for the technology to spread widely. Moreover, not everyone in Europe welcomed the idea of mass-produced books. The Church, which had long maintained control over the production and distribution of religious texts, was initially cautious about the printing press, fearing that it could spread ideas that challenged its authority. Nevertheless, Gutenberg's invention spread rapidly throughout Europe, and within just a few decades printing presses were established in cities from Venice to Paris, from Nuremberg to London. The growth of print shops led to the rise of a new class of professionals: printers, publishers, and booksellers. The printing press, once a small innovative device in mines, became the cornerstone of the European information revolution. Despite its slow initial acceptance, and the resistance from powerful institutions like the Catholic Church, the printing press was an irreversible force. Its impact on the world was profound, laying the foundation for the modern world by giving birth to the mass production of knowledge. This technological advancement accelerated the pace of intellectual and scientific progress and made possible the sharing of ideas across borders and between cultures. Gutenberg, the man who revolutionized the world of printing, became a figure of immense historical significance. Yet his own life was a tale of failure as much as success. Though his press brought great success to his city and made him famous, Gutenberg was not financially successful in his lifetime. He died in relative obscurity, without the wealth that his invention would later bring to others. Nevertheless, his legacy lived on, and his creation would reshape the course of history forever. The press's cultural and religious impact. The printing press, while initially just a technological advancement, had an immense cultural and religious impact that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of history. Its invention did not just transform how books were produced, it changed the very fabric of European society. It influenced religious movements, spurred the spread of humanist ideas, and helped lay the foundations for modern science and literacy. The Reformation spreading the seeds of religious change. One of the most significant effects of the printing press was its role in the Protestant Reformation. Before the advent of the printing press, the Catholic Church held a monopoly on religious knowledge and the distribution of sacred texts. Bibles were written in Latin, a language that most common people could not read, and the clergy were the primary interpreters of the Word of God. This system allowed the Church to maintain control over spiritual life in Europe. However, the printing press made it possible for ideas to spread far more rapidly than ever before. When Martin Luther, a German monk and theologian, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church in 1517, criticizing the sale of indulgences and other church practices, his ideas were quickly printed and distributed. Thanks to the printing press, Luther's theses reached a broad audience across Europe, sparking debates and challenging the authority of the Church in ways that had never been possible before. Luther's writings, including his translations of the Bible into the vernacular German, were printed and circulated widely. For the first time, ordinary people could read the Bible for themselves, without relying on the interpretation of the clergy. This shift empowered individuals and contributed to the rise of Protestantism, a movement that would break from the Catholic Church and lead to the formation of various Protestant denominations across Europe. The spread of Lutheranism and other Protestant ideas, such as those advocated by John Calvin, was facilitated by the rapid distribution of pamphlets, books, and treatises. The printing press played a crucial role in spreading these reformist ideas, not only across Germany but throughout the entire continent. The Reformation challenged the established religious and political order in Europe and led to a century of religious conflict, including the 30 Years' War, which reshaped the religious map of Europe. For the Catholic Church, the rise of Protestantism was seen as a direct challenge to its authority. In response, the Church began to print its own materials, including Catholic doctrines and the Counter-Reformation texts that aimed to reassert Church authority. The printing press thus became a tool used by both reformers and the established Church in their battle for the hearts and minds of Europe. The Reformation led to greater religious pluralism in Europe, as countries such as England, Switzerland, and parts of Germany embraced Protestant ideas, while other regions such as Spain, Italy, and France remained firmly Catholic. The ability to print Bibles and religious texts in vernacular languages rather than Latin democratized access to religious knowledge and helped lay the groundwork for later movements that would further challenge religious and political authority. The rise of humanism, the birth of modern thought. The invention of the printing press was also pivotal in the rise of humanism. a cultural and intellectual movement that emphasized the study of classical antiquity and the potential of human reason. Humanism had its roots in the Renaissance, a period of renewed interest in the art, literature, and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. Before the press, many of the classical texts of antiquity were scattered in handwritten manuscripts, which were both rare and expensive. These works were confined to wealthy patrons and scholars, limiting their impact. However, with the invention of the printing press, the works of the ancient philosophers, poets, and scientists became more widely available. Writers such as Petrarch, Erasmus, and Thomas More began to publish works that celebrated the potential of human achievement. The press made it possible to share these ideas on a much larger scale. Renaissance humanism, which focused on the study of classical texts and the value of the individual, spread rapidly throughout Europe. Humanists believed that education and knowledge should be available to all, not just the elite. They promoted the study of subjects such as grammar, rhetoric, history, and philosophy. The printing press helped spread these ideas, especially in the form of printed books, which became more affordable and accessible. Universities, libraries, and private citizens began to accumulate vast collections of books, making learning more widespread. The impact of humanism on the arts was also profound. The availability of classical texts inspired artists, poets, and thinkers to create works that were focused on the human experience. Writers like Erasmus and Machiavelli, through their printed works, began to challenge medieval ideas and contribute to a new understanding of politics, religion, and ethics. The shift from religious to secular thinking marked a turning point in European intellectual history, and the printing press played an essential role in facilitating this transition. The scientific revolution, new ideas for a new world. The printing press's influence on science cannot be overstated. Before the advent of printing, scientific knowledge was often confined to the hands of a few scholars, and new discoveries were slow to spread. The work of scientists and philosophers was written out by hand and circulated within limited circles. With the press, however, the dissemination of new ideas in the sciences became more efficient and widespread. The work of Renaissance scientists such as Nicolaus Copernicus, who proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun, and Galileo Galilei, who used the telescope to make groundbreaking astronomical discoveries, benefited immensely from the printing press. Their works, once written by hand or shared in small academic circles, were now available to a much wider audience, leading to rapid advancements in science and the eventual scientific revolution. The printing press also enabled the spread of medical knowledge. Advances in anatomy, surgery, and pharmacology could now be printed and distributed to physicians across Europe, leading to more standardized practices. Printed books, such as Andreas Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica, which detailed the human body in exquisite illustrations, helped lay the foundations for modern medicine. The accessibility of printed materials also contributed to the development of empirical research, as scientists could now share their observations and theories with a broader community. This exchange of ideas accelerated progress in fields ranging from physics to biology and medicine, making the scientific revolution one of the most transformative periods in human history. The legacy of the printing press, a new age of information. The printing press was not merely a tool for disseminating knowledge, it was a catalyst for the rapid spread of ideas that would change the world. It contributed to the Reformation, the rise of humanism, the scientific revolution, and the eventual birth of the modern world. By making books more affordable and accessible, it democratized knowledge, allowing people of all social classes to engage with new ideas and question the established order. The printing press also had profound effects on literacy. As books became more widely available, literacy rates began to rise. In the 16th century, the spread of printed books in vernacular languages, rather than Latin, which had been the language of scholarship for centuries, meant that more people could read and write. This increase in literacy would pave the way for the Enlightenment and the development of democratic ideals in the centuries that followed. The world that the printing press helped to create was one in which ideas could be shared more freely, where individuals could engage with the knowledge of the past and contribute to the knowledge of the future. The press was instrumental in the creation of a global exchange of information, and it laid the groundwork for the modern information age. As we reflect on the printing press's legacy, it prompts us to consider how the spread of knowledge continues to shape our world today. How might the rapid dissemination of information, enabled by digital technologies, alter the course of history in the same way that Gutenberg's press did centuries ago? And what role does the access to knowledge play in shaping our ideas, our societies, and our future? Life on the frontier. The struggles of pioneers in early America setting up shop in the New World. The story of the American frontier is one that often evokes images of rugged individuals braving the wild and uncharted lands of the New World. But the reality of frontier life in the early days of American settlement was far from the romanticized version we often hear. Pioneers, settlers, and explorers endured immense hardship as they carved out a living from the vast and unforgiving wilderness. The journey to the frontier was not just about discovering new lands, it was about survival. By the early 1600s, European nations were actively exploring and colonizing the Americas, and settlers began arriving in what would become the United States. These first pioneers were motivated by various factors: a desire for religious freedom, the promise of land and wealth, or the hope of a better life in a land of opportunities. But the reality of life on the frontier was far more difficult than they had imagined. In the beginning, most of the settlers made their way to the eastern part of the continent, along the Atlantic coast, where colonies like Jamestown, Plymouth, and later New York were established. The land was fertile, and the natural resources seemed abundant. However, the early settlers soon discovered that establishing a settlement required more than just planting crops and building houses. They had to contend with unfamiliar terrain, unpredictable weather, and a host of dangers from both nature and indigenous people. Settlers quickly learned that building a successful colony meant more than just surviving the harsh conditions of the frontier. It was about establishing a sustainable way of life. They needed to secure food and shelter, build infrastructure, and protect themselves from the ever-present threat of attack, whether from Native American tribes or rival European powers. The early colonists, often inexperienced and ill-prepared, had to adapt quickly to the unfamiliar landscape. Many suffered from disease, hunger, and exposure, and survival in the early years of settlement often seemed like a fragile hope rather than a guarantee. In addition to these hardships, settlers also had to deal with the constant threat of violence. Native American tribes had been living on the land for centuries, and their way of life was deeply tied to the land and its resources. As European settlers moved westward, conflicts over land, resources, and cultural differences led to violent confrontation. Some tribes saw the arrival of European settlers as an invasion, while others tried to negotiate or coexist, but tension and violence were inevitable. Life on the frontier, particularly for those who moved beyond the established colonies, was a constant struggle. Most settlers lived in small, self-sufficient farms where they grew their own food and raised livestock. The daily life of a pioneer was dictated by the seasons, and there was little time for rest. Crops had to be planted and harvested, homes had to be built and repaired, and animals needed to be tended to. The pioneering spirit was fueled by necessity, as survival depended on hard work, innovation, and the willingness to face the unknown. But the life of a settler wasn't just one of hardship and struggle. There was a profound sense of hope and determination that drove the settlers. They saw themselves as part of a grand experiment, one that would expand the boundaries of the known world and create a new society in the wilderness. The idea of starting anew, of creating a home and a community where none existed before, inspired many. And while the work was grueling, there was also a sense of pride in what they were building, a future for themselves and their families in a land of possibility. Yet, despite the hope that fueled the settlers' journey, the question remained: could they truly build a lasting society on the frontier? How long would it take for the colonies to move beyond the constant struggle for survival and establish a more stable and thriving society? Hardships and survival tactics. As the first settlers and pioneers pushed further into the American wilderness, life on the frontier became a daily battle for survival. While the initial hope of a new beginning and fertile land motivated many to embark on the arduous journey, the harsh reality of frontier life quickly set in. The landscape was unforgiving, and the settlers faced not just the physical toll of the land but also the psychological strain of isolation, fear, and the constant fight against nature's unpredictability. The strain of the land. For the early settlers, the land was both a source of sustenance and a challenge. While fertile land was abundant in some regions, the pioneers had little time to waste once they arrived. Their primary goal was to establish a settlement and produce enough food to survive the harsh winters, especially as they moved further west into the unsettled and often wild frontier. As a result, survival depended on their ability to adapt and innovate quickly. In the colonies and the expanding frontier, settlers quickly learned that planting crops was far from simple. They needed to clear dense forests, build fields, and till soil that had never before been touched by plows. Many early pioneers struggled with rocky soil or swampy areas that made farming difficult. And the process of clearing the land, felling trees, burning brush, and digging drainage ditches was physically exhausting. For the first few years, much of the settlers' energy was devoted to making the land workable, and the fruits of their labor wouldn't be realized until later seasons. Even when the land was ready for planting, settlers had to contend with a variety of new challenges. Early farmers grew crops like corn, wheat, and vegetables, but crop failures were common. Harsh weather, including droughts or floods, could ruin entire harvests. Even when crops did succeed, the settlers often found that their lack of experience with farming on such a large scale meant they struggled to maintain a reliable food supply. These cycles of abundance followed by scarcity contributed to the constant anxiety of frontier life. Hunting and gathering, though a vital supplement to their diet, also carried their own risks. While wild game such as deer, bear, and wild turkey could be hunted, they were not always easy to find, and the forests were not always kind to those who ventured too far. Settlers would often need to rely on primitive tools such as rifles, traps, and fishing nets. A lack of proper ammunition or tools could leave them vulnerable, especially if they ventured deep into uncharted territory and encountered hostile environments. The threat of disease. Disease was another formidable adversary on the frontier. Isolated from medical help and with few resources to draw upon, settlers were vulnerable to illnesses that spread quickly. Epidemics of smallpox, cholera, dysentery, and influenza frequently decimated settlements. The medical knowledge available to the settlers was rudimentary at best. Without doctors or hospitals, people relied on home remedies, herbal medicine, and the knowledge of the elders in the community. But even these remedies were often insufficient, and death from illness was common, especially during the early years of settlement. The lack of sanitation in many frontier settlements also made disease spread more rapidly. Settlers lived in close quarters, and personal hygiene was often limited by the conditions in which they lived. Drinking water was often contaminated, and food preservation methods were basic at best. Diseases like malaria, which thrived in the swamps of the American South, spread through mosquito bites, further complicating the fight for survival. For many pioneers, illness or death from disease became an inescapable part of life on the frontier. The constant threat of conflict, perhaps one of the most significant challenges settlers faced, particularly in the early years, was the threat of conflict with Native American tribes. While many settlers initially tried to coexist peacefully with the Native Americans, tensions inevitably arose as European settlers encroached on the land that indigenous peoples had lived on for centuries. The relationships between settlers and Native American tribes were complex. While some tribes offered trade, guidance, and even assistance to the settlers, others saw the invasion of their land as a direct threat to their way of life. For example, as settlers pushed westward across the continent, they began to encroach on the lands of the Sioux, the Iroquois, and countless other tribes, displacing people from their homes and disrupting their traditional ways of life. The resulting conflicts led to violence, and for many settlers, fear of Native American attacks was a constant concern. Stories of raids, massacres, and kidnappings spread through frontier communities, creating an atmosphere of anxiety. While some settlers were able to build relationships with local tribes through trade and negotiation, others faced violent confrontations that left them with few options other than to fight or flee. The establishment of forts and militias became common, and settlers often banded together for mutual protection. But this did not eliminate the ever-present risk of violent conflict. In addition to intertribal conflict, there were also territorial disputes between the European settlers themselves. Competing claims over land, especially in the Western territories where the lines between British, Spanish, and French claims were blurred, created further tension. Settlers often found themselves caught between the competing interests of European powers, especially as the frontier expanded further into unknown territories. The role of women on the frontier. Life on the frontier was not just a male-dominated experience. Women played a vital role in the survival and success of frontier settlements. They were expected to work just as hard as men, performing a wide range of tasks including cooking, cleaning, childcare, and helping with farming and livestock. Women's responsibility is extended beyond the home as they help to establish communities, supporting their families through the daily struggle for survival. In addition to the household chores, women were also instrumental in healthcare on the frontier. They acted as midwives, nurses, and healers, relying on their knowledge of herbal medicine and folk remedies. In many ways, women were the backbone of early frontier life. Their strength, resilience, and resourcefulness were crucial to the survival of their families and their communities. However, despite their essential role, women on the frontier faced immense challenges. They were often isolated from other women and their families, and the hardships they faced were often overlooked. The dangers of childbirth, the weight of raising children in such an uncertain environment, and the constant struggle for basic necessities were daily realities for women. The loneliness and separation from more established communities were psychological tolls that could not be easily overcome. The struggle for community, while frontier life was often solitary, pioneers also understood the importance of building a sense of community. Early settlers often lived in small, isolated farms or cabins, and their survival depended on cooperation. Though their lives were tough and the land unforgiving, neighbors helped each other through hard times. Whether it was during harvests, building homes, or fighting off threats, settlers relied on each other to get by. Community was not just about social connection, it was about survival. Frontier towns and settlements were often built around common needs: a source of water, fertile land, or trading routes. As settlements grew, they often established schools, churches, and other community institutions to provide stability. But even as they began to create these small pockets of civilization, the frontier remained a place of constant uncertainty. Through all of these hardships, pioneers displayed remarkable resilience. Their capacity to adapt and innovate allowed them to build communities in the face of adversity. The frontier, despite its dangers and difficulties, represented the hope of a new life and the opportunity to carve out a spacey, a rapidly changing world. As the settlers looked to the future, they were left with an important question: how could they turn the wilderness into a thriving, permanent society, one that could endure far beyond the struggles of their first years? The legacy of the pioneers. The pioneers who settled the American frontier were not just the hardy souls who endured the harsh conditions of the wilderness. They were also the architects of the future of the United States. Their legacy is not just in the towns they built or the land they cultivated, but in the cultural, social, and economic structures that emerged from their struggles. While they faced immense hardships, disease, isolation, violence, and the relentless demands of survival, their perseverance and resilience laid the foundation for the growth of a nation that would eventually become a global power. The expansion of the American frontier. By the mid-19th century, the frontier had expanded significantly, and with it the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to expand across the continent, took hold. The idea of pushing westward was not only about acquiring land, it was tied to a deeply ingrained belief in American exceptionalism and a sense of mission to spread democracy, freedom, and capitalism. The Homestead Act of 1862, which granted free land to settlers willing to cultivate it, was a direct response to the desire to populate the Western territories and turn the vast, untamed wilderness into a series of productive farms and settlements. The pioneers who took advantage of this land grant system were often referred to as homesteaders. They moved to the Great Plains and other areas of the West, carving farms out of the wilderness. Despite the difficulties of this life, constant battles with nature, limited resources, and the threat of attacks from Native American tribes, these pioneers contributed to the growth of agriculture, infrastructure, and industry in the United States. Their hard work transformed the landscape, creating thriving communities where once there had been nothing. The railroads, which expanded rapidly in the latter half of the 19th century, played a major role in the settlement of the American West. They made it possible to transport goods, people, and livestock more efficiently across vast distances. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, linked the east and west coasts of the United States, opening up new markets and opportunities for settlers and businesses alike. However, the westward expansion was not without consequences. As settlers moved further into Native American territories, conflicts intensified. The The forced relocation of indigenous peoples, the destruction of their cultures, and the violent clashes between settlers and native tribes became some of the darkest chapters in American history. The pioneers, often unintentionally, played a part in this tragic displacement, although their motivations were generally tied to survival and the desire for a better life. Nevertheless, the consequences of this expansion were felt for generations. The evolution of communities and towns. While survival was the primary focus for many pioneers, over time the wilderness began to yield to the needs of community building. As more settlers arrived, towns and cities began to emerge. These early frontier towns were often little more than a collection of cabins and makeshift buildings, but they quickly grew into bustling communities with schools, churches, shops, and local government. These towns were the heart of frontier life. They became the center for trade, socialization, and cultural exchange. In the early days, life in these towns could be chaotic. There was often little law and order, and violence was not uncommon. But over time, the establishment of local government structures, law enforcement, and businesses helped stabilize these communities and set the stage for the growth of cities in the West. The creation of these towns was also the beginning of an economic transformation. As settlers brought their goods to market, local economies began to develop. Farming, mining, and cattle ranching were the primary industries that supported these early towns. The arrival of railroads further facilitated the movement of goods and people, creating new economic opportunities for settlers. Entrepreneurs opened shops, blacksmiths set up forges, and artisans began to provide essential services to the growing population. However, the life of a pioneer was never one of comfort. The first residents of these towns often lived in simple, rudimentary homes, log cabins or adobe houses that offered minimal protection from the elements. As towns grew, so did the complexity of daily life. But even as some pioneers moved beyond the struggles of mere survival, they still faced the constant pressure of the unknown. The pioneers' cultural and social impact. The pioneers who moved west were not just transforming the land, they were also transforming American society. The values they brought with them, self-reliance, hard work, individualism, shaped the cultural identity of the United States. The American frontier became a symbol of opportunity, a place where anyone could start fresh and build something from nothing. The spirit of the frontier also contributed to the development of American democracy. Frontier settlers, isolated from larger cities and governments, often had to create their own systems of governance. In many cases, these early settlers established town meetings, elected leaders, and created laws that allowed them to live together in a community. The idea of democratic participation was ingrained in the lives of many early pioneers, and this self-governance would become a cornerstone of American political life. Religion played an important role in frontier life as well. Many pioneers were motivated by religious freedom, and as a result the frontier became a place of religious diversity. Protestant missionaries were among the first to settle in many areas of the West, and they helped establish churches, schools, and communities that served as the foundation for the region's spiritual life. In addition, religious practices helped bind settlers together in the face of adversity, offering hope and comfort during difficult times. The pioneers were also responsible for bringing European cultural traditions to the frontier. While the wild nature of the frontier may have seemed far removed from civilization, pioneers brought with them art, music, literature, and European customs. These elements of culture contributed to the creation of a new, distinctly American identity. The settlers on the frontier became part of a larger narrative, one that was shaped by both the traditions of their homeland and the experiences they had in the New World. The end of the frontier and its legacy. By the late 19th century, the American frontier had essentially come to an end. The rapid westward expansion and the settlement of the land were completed, and the United States had become a nation that spanned from coast to coast. The Homestead Act of 1862, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and the influx of settlers into the Western Territories had fulfilled the promise of manifest destiny. However, the closing of the frontier did not mark the end of its legacy. The values and experiences of the pioneers continued to shape American society throughout the 20th century and beyond. The notion of the self-made man, the belief in opportunity and hard work, and the spirit of independence became defining characteristics of the American ethos. The pioneering spirit, though no longer tested on the frontier, continued to influence American culture, politics, and identity. The history of the American frontier is complex, filled with triumphs and tragedies. The legacy of the pioneers is one of both creation and destruction, creation of a nation, but also destruction of indigenous cultures and lands. Yet the determination, resilience, and hope of the settlers on the frontier cannot be denied. They built a country from the ground up, laying the foundation for the United States as it is known today. As we reflect on the lives of the pioneers, we are left with a question: how do the challenges they faced and the way they overcame them shape our understanding of the American experience today? And how can the legacy of the frontier continue to influence the future of a nation that was in many ways built on struggle and perseverance? The Salem witch trials, when fear ruled the colonies, the root of witchcraft panic. The Salem witch trials of 1692 are among the most infamous events in early American history. What began as a small, localized incident in a small Puritan settlement spiraled into one of the most deadly witch hunts in history. The trials led to the execution of 20 people, the majority of whom were women, and the imprisonment of many others. But how did this terrifying panic begin? What forces, cultural, religious, and social, came together to create a climate where suspicion, fear, and superstition flourished so easily? To understand the Salem witch trials, it's essential to understand the historical and social context in which they occurred. The Puritan settlers of New England, who had come to America seeking religious freedom, were living in a society that was deeply steeped in a belief in the supernatural. The Puritans held strict religious beliefs and saw the world in binary terms: good versus evil, saved versus damned. To them, witchcraft was a very real threat to their way of life and their religious purity. It was viewed as a direct assault on God's authority and the moral fabric of society. In the late 17th century, the Puritan colonies were struggling with various pressures, political, social, and religious. The Puritans had suffered a series of setbacks, including wars with Native Americans and a changing political landscape that saw the consolidation of royal control over the colonies. These challenges created an environment of fear and anxiety. In Salem, Massachusetts, a small community plagued by economic difficulties, bitter rivalries, and long-standing religious divisions, tension was ripe for something to set off a crisis. It began in the winter of 1691, when several young girls in Salem Village, now Danvers, began exhibiting strange behaviors. The girls, including Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams, would have fits, screaming, convulsing, and contorting their bodies in unnatural ways. They claimed to be afflicted by invisible forces and reported seeing specters or apparitions of people tormenting them. The girls' behavior initially caused concern, and the town's minister, Samuel Parris, was alarmed. However, the cause of the girls' fits was quickly attributed to witchcraft. At the time, any unexplained illness or unusual behavior could be seen as evidence of a demonic presence, and Salem's residents were quick to leap to conclusions. At the heart of the witchcraft panic was the belief that Satan could infiltrate the community and use individuals to do his bidding. The Puritans believed that witchcraft was a serious crime against God and that it was punishable by death. The girls' strange behaviors became a perfect storm of fear and superstition. As their accusations spread, the people they named as witches, often women, were arrested, interrogated, and put on trial. The fear spread quickly, and soon other villages in the area were affected by the witch hunt. The trials were fueled by a number of factors, including the Puritan belief in predestination, the idea that God had already chosen who would be saved and who would be damned, and the intense pressure to conform to strict religious and social norms. This created a culture where any deviation from the norm could be seen as evidence of wrongdoing, especially if it was linked to the supernatural. The Puritan community was close-knit and deeply religious, but it was also deeply divided by power struggles, rivalries, and a history of tension with neighboring communities. What began with a few girls' accusations snowballed into a widespread panic. The sense of fear was not just about witches, it was about an erosion of social and religious order. It reflected the deep anxieties of a society in which religious faith and community integrity were seen as fragile. For many in Salem, the trials became a way to restore order and assert control over a world that seemed increasingly unpredictable. But even as the trials escalated, questions began to arise. Could it really be that so many people, often well-respected members of the community, were involved in witchcraft. Were these accusations merely the product of hysteria, or was there a more systematic reason behind the frenzy? As the trials continued, the accusations became more outlandish, with people being accused of conspiring with the devil and committing heinous acts, such as flying on broomsticks or cursing others. The evidence presented in the trials was often flimsy. Spectral evidence, or testimony about visions or dreams, was given weight in the courts, leading to the execution of 20 people, most of them women. The atmosphere in Salem became one of intense paranoia. People turned on one another, accusing friends, neighbors, and even family members of witchcraft. Fear of being accused of witchcraft led many to accuse others in order to save themselves. The close-knit community was torn apart as distrust and suspicion grew. But was it simply fear and superstition that drove the trials? Or was there something more? Was there a deeper social and political motivation behind the trials, accusations, and the growing frenzy? As the accusations of witchcraft spread across Salem, they began to snowball into a full-blown panic. What started as the inexplicable behaviors of a few young girls in Salem Village soon spiraled out of control, turning into a witch hunt that consumed the entire community. The trials were not just about the pursuit of justice. They were a reflection of the fears, power struggles, and anxieties that were tearing apart the fabric of colonial society. The role of fear and religion. At the core of the witch trials was the Puritan belief in the supernatural. Puritans believed that the devil actively worked to corrupt humanity and that witchcraft was a form of allegiance to Satan. For a community that was already deeply suspicious of outsiders, difference, and deviation from the religious norm, the witch trials became an outlet for their growing fears. The Puritans were living in an isolated world where social, political, and economic pressures were high, and any event or behavior that couldn't be easily explained could be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft. The Puritan Church and its ministers played an essential role in fueling the witch hunt. Minister Samuel Parris, whose own daughter and niece were among the first to display strange behavior, took a central role in urging the community to root out the supposed witch. The clergy promoted the idea that the devil was infiltrating the community and that the trials were a necessary means of purging evil. The strict religious dogma and the focus on predestination, an idea that only a chosen few would be saved, created a deep-seated anxiety among the colonists. If someone was accused of being a witch, it meant they were on the side of the devil, and the community's very survival was threatened. The trials also came at a time of political and social instability. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had been under intense political scrutiny, especially following King James II's efforts to consolidate control over the American colonies. The religious leaders in Salem saw the witch trials as a way to assert their authority over their community and to maintain order. The trials also served as a mechanism to protect the Puritan worldview by removing those who were seen as disruptive, whether they were outsiders, women who didn't conform to expectations, or people with unconventional beliefs. The first accusations and the spread of fear. In early 1692, the strange behavior of a few young girls, most notably Abigail Williams and Betty Parris, was attributed to the influence of witchcraft. The girls had fits, screamed, and contorted their bodies in unnatural ways, claiming to be attacked by unseen forces. Their unusual behavior quickly spread throughout the community, and accusations began to emerge. The first women accused of witchcraft were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, a slave from the West Indies who worked in Reverend Parris's household. Tituba, the only one of the three accused women who survived, was coerced into confessing. In exchange for her confession, she claimed that a group of witches, including prominent members of Salem society, had conspired with the devil. This confession, which appeared to validate the girls' claims, sparked an even greater wave of accusation. The idea that someone had confessed to being a witch fed into the fear that Salem was under siege by the devil, and the community's resolve to rid itself of witches grew stronger. The subsequent months saw a dramatic increase in the number of accusations. The girls who had originally displayed symptoms were soon joined by others, and the hysteria began to spread to neighboring towns. What began as a local event grew into a regional phenomenon. Women, men, children, and even the elderly were accused, with some of the wealthiest members of the community now under suspicion. What was striking about the accusations was that they weren't limited to social outcasts or outsiders. respected members of Salem society were increasingly targeted, including well-known families, and even the wife of one of the most influential ministers, Reverend George Burroughs. Spectral evidence, and the growing frenzy. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Salem witch trials was the use of spectral evidence. This concept allowed accusers to testify that they had seen the spectre, or ghost, of the accused person tormenting them, or performing acts of witchcraft. Spectral evidence held a powerful sway in the trials because it could not be disproven. If a victim claimed that they saw the spectre of a person appearing to harm them, that was enough to convict the accused. This idea of spectral evidence was deeply tied to the religious beliefs of the Puritans, who believed in the existence of an invisible spiritual realm that influenced their daily lives. However, the reliance on such intangible, unverifiable evidence made the trials increasingly absurd. The accused had little defense against these accusations. Often, the only way to escape a death sentence was to confess, whether or not they were guilty. Those who confessed were spared execution, but their reputations were destroyed. Some accusers, like Tituba, admitted to being witches in order to save themselves. But those who maintained their innocence or refused to confess were seen as guilty of trying to resist the will of God. As the trials progressed, the accusations became more widespread and more outrageous, and people were accused of causing everything from illness to crop failure to misfortune, and the reasoning behind the accusations became more tenuous. Entire families were destroyed, as accusations of witchcraft often divided loved ones. Those who were accused frequently found themselves isolated from their communities, with no means of defense. Neighbors turned on one another, and suspicion crept into every aspect of daily life. The frenzy reached its peak during the summer of 1692, when trials were held and the community's fear culminated in public executions. In the space of a few months, the trials escalated to a deadly crescendo. Many of the accused were hanged, and others were pressed to death with heavy stones. The public executions were meant to serve as a warning to the rest of the community, but instead, they amplified the chaos and paranoia, the role of power, gender, and social struggles. While the Salem witch trials were driven by fear and superstition, they were also fueled by deeper social and gender dynamics. The majority of those accused of witchcraft were women, often those who did not conform to the expectations of the time. The role of women in Puritan society was defined by strict gender norms, and any deviation from this norm could be seen as evidence of witchcraft. Women who were outspoken, independent, or did not fit neatly into the roles of wife and mother were often accused of being witches. The trials thus became an outlet for the community's frustrations with women who challenged the status quo. In addition, the trials were marked by deep social and political divisions. Many of those who were accused came from families that were either marginalized or in conflict with the more powerful families of Salem. This created an atmosphere where personal vendettas, family feuds, and rivalries could be expressed through the accusations of witchcraft. The trials were not just about witchcraft, they were a means by which people could settle old scores and assert power over one another. At the heart of the trials was a struggle for control. The Puritan community was built on conformity, and those who failed to conform, whether through social behavior, gender roles, or religious beliefs, became targets for accusations. The Salem witch trials represented a moment when fear and superstition overtook reason, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior were rigidly enforced by the state and the church. But as the trials continued, it became apparent that the frenzy could not be sustained. Was there any truth to the accusations? Were innocent people being executed? And what would be the lasting effects of this madness on the people of Salem and New England? The aftermath and reflection. By the fall of 1692, the Salem witch trials had reached their tragic climax. Over the course of the summer, more than 200 people had been accused of witchcraft, and 20 people, mostly women, had been executed, many by hanging, while others died in prison or were subjected to brutal forms of punishment. Yet, as the frenzy began to die down, a deeper reflection took place within Salem and beyond, questioning the validity of the trials and the motivations behind such horrific events. The collapse of the witch hunt. The turning point came in October 1692, when the tide of public opinion began to shift. Prominent figures, including Reverend Increase Mather, the father of Cotton Mather, one of the primary ministers involved in the trials, began to speak out against the use of spectral evidence. Reverend Mather, once a not-son supporter of the trials, began to recognize the dangers of relying on intangible, unverifiable evidence in a court of law. He famously declared, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." Mather's change of heart, along with increasing skepticism from other members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, led to the eventual discrediting of the trials. A formal investigation into the trials was launched, and in 1693, the colonial governor, William Phips, who had been caught up in the fervor, intervened and halted the proceedings. He also ordered the release of many of the accused. The courts that had been so quick to condemn the accused now reversed their decisions, and the trial proceedings were dismissed. The damage, however, had already been done. The fear and panic that had gripped the colony had left deep scars in the community. The trials had torn apart families, destroyed reputations, and instilled a lasting sense of distrust in the legal and religious systems. The process of scapegoating innocent people had resulted in a great loss, not just of life, but of faith in the ability to distinguish between good and evil in the face of mass hysteria. The social and political consequences. The social impact of the trials was profound. Salem, once a relatively peaceful Puritan settlement, was left fractured and divided. Families that had once been close-knit were now torn apart, with accusations of witchcraft serving as a tool for personal vengeance and social control. Neighbors turned on each other, and the relationships that had once bound the community together were destroyed. The trials also had a lasting impact on the legal system. The use of spectral evidence, testimony about dreams and visions that could not be corroborated, was discredited, and it became clear that trials based on such unreliable evidence could not be allowed to continue. The Salem witch trials were a turning point in the history of American law, helping to establish the legal principle that accused individuals had the right to a fair trial, and that evidence must be based on physical facts rather than the supernatural or speculative. The trials, and the injustices they exposed, also had a lasting effect on the role of women in colonial society. While the majority of the accused were women, the trials reinforced the idea that women who did not conform to strict gender roles were vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. Women who were seen as outcasts, or who challenged the authority of men, were more likely to be accused. This reflected the broader social dynamics of the time, where women were often excluded from power and were subject to the control of men, whether through marriage or religious authority. While the trials had a profound impact on the people of Salem and Massachusetts, the broader colonial world also began to reflect on what had occurred. The events were not isolated to Salem. They occurred in a broader context of superstition, fear, and the collapse of rational thinking in a society gripped by anxiety. The fear of witches had been fueled by the collapse of European social orders and the fear of the unknown, and it would continue to resonate throughout the American colonies, although no event would reach the magnitude of the Salem trials. Post-trial reflection and atonement. In the years following the trials, many of the key figures involved, including those who had been responsible for condemning the accused, expressed regret and guilt. The judges and ministers who had participated in the trials publicly admitted that they had been wrong to allow the hysteria to take hold of their communities. Many individuals who had accused others of witchcraft later recanted their statements, expressing deep regret for the role they had played in the witch hunt. For the families of the accused, the process of atonement and seeking justice was slow and painful. In 1702, a formal court of inquiry declared the trials unlawful. The colony eventually passed a law that allowed for restitution to the families of those who had been executed or wrongfully accused. In 1711, the Massachusetts government passed a bill that compensated the families of the victims, though the sums were small and did little to undo the damage that had been done. Though some of the convicted witches were posthumously exonerated, the trials had left scars that went beyond the individual. They raised profound questions about the dangers of mob mentality, unchecked religious authority, and the dangers of scapegoat. The Salem witch trials became a cautionary tale that would resonate in American society for generations. As the years passed, they would be studied as a tragic chapter in the history of colonial America, offering lessons about the perils of fear-driven justice. The legacy of the trials. The legacy of the Salem witch trials has endured through the centuries, shaping both American culture and the broader history of witch hunts. The trials have become a symbol of the dangers of mass hysteria and the consequences of irrational fear. Over time, the trials have been interpreted not just as a moment of religious excess, but as a cautionary tale about the limits of power, the dangers of intolerance, and the frailty of justice when it is based on superstition and fear rather than reason and evidence. The Salem witch trials also remain an important symbol for the rights of the accused. The trials brought into stark relief the importance of due process, the right to a fair trial, and the protection of individuals from baseless accusation. They also contributed to the development of American legal principles, such as the presumption of innocence, that would later become a cornerstone of the US Constitution. Perhaps most importantly, the trials remind us of the power of fear to shape history. It was fear of the unknown, fear of the supernatural, and fear of social collapse that drove the Salem witch trials. And as we look to the present, we are left with the lesson that fear can still be a powerful force in society, one that can tear communities apart and lead to grave injustices. As we reflect on the legacy of the Salem witch trials, we must ask, how does the fear of the other, whether based on religion, politics, or identity, continue to shape our society today? And how can we, as individuals and as a society, ensure that we are never again swayed by irrational fear, but instead guided by reason and justice? Napoleon's exile, the boring life of a fallen emperor. From glory to downfall, Napoleon Bonaparte, once the undisputed ruler of most of Europe, was a man whose ambition knew no bound. His rise to power was as meteoric as it was extraordinary, and his reign left a profound mark on European history. Napoleon was born on the island of Corsica in 1769, and by the age of 30, he had become the Emperor of the French. Under his leadership, France expanded its influence and dominance across Europe. Napoleon's military genius and ambition led to the creation of an empire that, at its height, stretched from Spain to Russia, and from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Napoleon was not just a military commander, he was a revolutionary figure. He embraced the ideals of the French Revolution, instituting reforms that modernized France and much of Europe. His Napoleonic Code, a system of civil law, influenced legal systems across the world. He reformed the education system, centralized the government, and promoted religious tolerance. He brought stability to France after the chaotic years of the Revolution and subsequent rise of radical political factions. Yet, despite all of his accomplishments, Napoleon's downfall was as dramatic as his rise. His ambition, coupled with his military campaigns, eventually led to his undoing. The turning point came in 1812, with his disastrous invasion of Russia. The campaign, which was intended to cement French dominance in Europe, ended in catastrophe, with the loss of nearly the entire French army. The Russian winter, combined with logistical failures and fierce Russian resistance, decimated Napoleon's force. The failure marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. By 1814, Napoleon had been defeated by a coalition of European powers, including Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia. The once mighty emperor was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. For the first time, Napoleon was removed from the scene of battle, no longer the ruler of an empire, but a fallen leader with little more than his title and his reputation left. However, Napoleon's exile would be far from quiet. Despite the loss of his empire, he continued to dream of returning to power. His time on Elba, while marked by attempts to hold on to his status, would ultimately serve as a prelude to his final and most infamous downfall. But what was life like for Napoleon in exile? How did a man who had once commanded armies and controlled a continent now spend his days in relative isolation on a small island? And how did his time on Elba set the stage for his dramatic return to France? Life on St. Helena, Napoleon's time on Elba, though brief and filled with attempts to recapture power, was a mere prelude to the more enduring period of exile that would come after his final defeat. In 1815, after his escape from Elba and brief return to power in what would become known as the 100 Days, Napoleon was defeated once again at the Battle of Waterloo by the Allied forces of Britain, Prussia, the Netherlands, other European nations. This time there would be no escape. In October 1815, Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, located in the South Atlantic Ocean, roughly 1,200 miles from the nearest landmass, Africa. St. Helena was a small volcanic island, measuring only 10 miles long and 5 miles wide, and it was under British control. It was an ideal location for ensuring that Napoleon would be unable to escape again. The British authorities, eager to prevent his return to power and ensure that he would never again be a threat to European stability, carefully selected the island as his permanent place of exile. Napoleon's life on St. Helena was dramatically different from his former glory. Gone were the grand palaces, the armies, and the political intrigue of Europe. Instead, Napoleon was confined to a modest residence called Longwood House, a dilapidated former planter's estate. The house itself was poorly constructed, and Napoleon often complained about its dampness, the frequent rains, and the isolation of the island. His once great ambitions were now replaced by the monotonous routine of life on the island. St. Helena's remoteness made it nearly impossible for Napoleon to communicate with the outside world, or for any supporters to mount an effective effort to bring him back to power. Napoleon was placed under heavy British surveillance, with a small army of guards and a British governor overseeing his daily activities. He was allowed a small group of companions, including loyal aides and a few servants. But the freedom he once enjoyed was a distant memory. His every move was watched, and he was given little autonomy. Napoleon's days on St. Helena were filled with a mixture of frustration, reflection, and attempts to maintain his sense of importance. He would frequently receive visitors, many of them former officers who had served under him in his army. Some of these visitors were sympathetic to him, while others were merely curious about the once great emperor. Napoleon would spend hours discussing his past achievements, recounting his military victories, and justifying his decisions. However, his constant reminiscing and dictating of his memoirs seemed only to reinforce his isolation, as many of his conversations revolved around past glories that no longer mattered in the present. While Napoleon's physical health was deteriorating during his time on St. Helena, he continued to hold on to the hope of a return to power. In his final years, Napoleon often spoke of regaining his position and returning to France, but these thoughts seemed increasingly out of reach. His letters to various European leaders were ignored, and his dreams of being reinstated as emperor were met with indifference. Napoleon's hopes for escape were continually dashed by the British, who had learned from his previous escape and were determined to prevent any further upheaval. The island, while small and remote, became the setting for a rather mundane life. Napoleon, who had once commanded an empire, was now reduced to gardening, walking in the island's barren landscape, and engaging in the occasional game of chess or reading. He took up drawing, and attempted to study subjects such as history and geography, perhaps in an effort to fill the hours with something other than thoughts of his past life. But despite the distractions, there was no escaping the fact that he was a prisoner, exiled to a remote island for the rest of his days. Napoleon's situation grew increasingly dire as he dealt with health problems, including what appeared to be a series of stomach ailments. He complained of pain and discomfort, and his health declined steadily throughout the final years of his life. Though he was attended to by a small group of doctors, the medical care available on the island was rudimentary at best. Napoleon's symptoms worsened, and it became clear that he would not live much longer. As he faced his final days, Napoleon's thoughts turned to his legacy. His once grand vision for Europe had crumbled, and his dreams of a restored empire seemed more and more impossible. In his last years on St. Helena, he dictated his memoirs, telling the story of his life and his reign, and attempted to solidify his place in history. He was still deeply aware of his importance, not just as a military leader but as a historical figure, and he wished to be remembered not for his exile, but for his contributions to Europe. The irony of his exile on St. Helena was not lost on those around him. Here was a man who had once held sway over vast territories and made history with every decision he made, now reduced to a life of confinement and suffering on a tiny island. He was both the prisoner of his past actions and a prisoner of his unyielding ambition. Despite the isolation, Napoleon never fully gave up on the idea of a grand return. But by the time of his death in 1821, it was clear that there would be no more comebacks. Napoleon died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, after a long period of ill health. His death was officially attributed to stomach cancer, though there have been many theories about the exact cause, including poisoning. His death marked the final chapter of one of the most remarkable and tragic lives in history. The emperor who had once ruled over much of Europe now lay buried on an isolated island, far from the power and glory that had defined his life. St. Helena, once the place of his exile, became the final resting place of Napoleon Bonaparte. His tomb, a small, humble structure on the island, would become a site of pilgrimage for admirers of the emperor, even though his reign and ambitions were long gone. The lasting influence of Napoleon's reign. Napoleon Bonaparte's life and reign may have ended in the isolated exile on St. Helena, but the impact of his rule has resonated through history in ways that continue to shape Europe and the world today. His empire may have collapsed, but the changes he instigated, both politically and culturally, were far-reaching, and his legacy has persisted well beyond his death. Napoleon's political and legal legacy. One of Napoleon's most enduring legacies is the Napoleonic Code, a set of civil laws that revolutionized legal systems not just in France, but across Europe and the wider world. The Napoleonic Code, established in 1804, was one of the first comprehensive and modern legal systems to be implemented in Europe. It was based on the idea that law should be clear, accessible, and equally applied to all citizens, regardless of their social status or wealth. Before Napoleon, many European countries were still governed by a patchwork of feudal laws, local customs, and church regulations, all of which could vary dramatically from one region to another. The Napoleonic Code, however, provided a uniform legal framework that guaranteed individual rights, such as property rights, the equality of citizens before the law, and the secularization of the legal system. The Napoleonic Code had a profound impact on France, where it abolished many of the old privileges of the nobility and the church. It introduced principles such as equality before the law and the protection of private property, which were radical ideas for their time. But its influence spread far beyond France. The code was adopted or adapted in many countries that had been influenced by Napoleon's conquests. Nations like Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, and parts of Germany enacted similar law. Even countries that were not directly under Napoleon's rule, such as Japan and Latin American republics, would later adopt or be influenced by the principles of the Napoleonic Code. The creation of a modern legal framework that guaranteed the rights of individuals and protected property was one of Napoleon's most significant contributions. It shaped the legal systems of many nations and remains the foundation for civil law systems worldwide, affecting the way legal institutions function today. The spread of nationalism and modern statehood. Another significant aspect of Napoleon's legacy is the spread of nationalism and the modern concept of the nation-state. Napoleon's empire, while it was an authoritarian regime, also fostered the rise of national consciousness in many parts of Europe. His conquests brought the unification of previously fragmented states, and in the process he encouraged the idea that people with shared cultural, linguistic, and historical ties should be united under a single government. In Italy and Germany, for example, the Napoleonic era accelerated the unification movements that would later lead to the creation of modern nation-states. Napoleon's annexation of these regions and his establishment of satellite republics in Italy and the German states laid the groundwork for the future unification of both Italy and Germany in the 19th century. Though Napoleon's empire was built on conquest, the people of these regions often adopted the idea of national identity, which persisted long after Napoleon's downfall. In addition, Napoleon's reforms in the territories he controlled promoted the idea of meritocracy, where individuals could rise to power based on their abilities, rather than their birthright. This system, which was rooted in the French Revolution's principles of equality and liberty, became a model for other European countries that sought to modernize their own bureaucracies and institutions. Napoleon's efforts to modernize the administrative systems of France and its territories left a lasting impression on European governance, with many countries adopting similar systems of centralized control and professional civil services. The impact on European politics and military strategy. Napoleon's military genius, though it ultimately led to his downfall, has remained a crucial part of military history. His ability to rapidly mobilize and organize large, disciplined armies, combined with his innovative strategies and tactics, changed the nature of warfare. The Napoleonic Wars, which raged across Europe from 1803 to 1815, demonstrated the importance of logistics, speed, and coordination in modern warfare. His campaigns emphasized the use of artillery, the importance of a well-trained and efficient army, and the need for decisive battles that could quickly turn the tide of war. Napoleon's influence on military strategy extended far beyond his own era. The tactics he employed are still studied in military academies around the world. His concept of total war, in which entire nations are mobilized for battle, as well as his emphasis on the strategic use of massed forces and rapid maneuver, influenced the development of modern army. Even though Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo ended his reign, the military lessons from his campaigns have continued to shape the tactics of subsequent military leaders. On a broader scale, Napoleon's fall led to the reshaping of European geopolitics. After his defeat, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 attempted to restore the pre-Napoleonic order by redrawing the map of Europe and re-establishing monarchies that Napoleon had overthrown. However, the legacy of the Napoleonic era could not be undone. The political and social changes he had set in motion, particularly the spread of nationalism and the idea of the nation-state, could not be reversed. Napoleon's lasting cultural influence. Though Napoleon's reign ended in failure, his cultural impact was profound. His image as both a military hero and a tragic figure has fascinated historians, artists, and writers for centuries. His rise to power and subsequent fall from grace created a myth that has persisted in literature, art, and popular culture. In the 19th century, many authors and artists began to romanticize Napoleon's story. Writers like Victor Hugo in Les Miserables and Stendhal in The Red and the Black examined the complex character of Napoleon, blending admiration for his achievements with criticism of his tyranny. Napoleon's figure became the subject of numerous paintings, sculptures, and songs, often portraying him as both a tragic and heroic figure. In the 20th century, Napoleon's influence remained strong. His image was used as a symbol of both tyranny and revolution, and his story continued to inspire both political movements and popular narratives. His legacy, though built on the foundation of war and conquest, was intertwined with ideals of reform, modernization, and the fight for national unity. The final reflection: Napoleon's place in history. Napoleon's life and legacy offer a fascinating example of the rise and fall of a man who shaped the course of history. Though his time as Emperor of the French was brief, his influence on Europe and the world has been enduring. The reforms he implemented, the political structures he created, and the military strategies he pioneered left a deep imprint on the modern world. However, his fall, marked by his exile to St. Helena and his death at the age of 51, serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition. Napoleon's story is one of incredible achievement and dramatic failure, a man who rose from humble beginnings to reshape Europe, only to be brought down by his own hubris and the limits of power. His legacy, though complicated, remains one of the most compelling in history. As we look back on Napoleon's life, we are left with a question: how can the lessons of his rise and fall inform our understanding of leadership, ambition, and the fragility of power in the modern world? The rise and fall of the Berlin Wall, dividing a nation, uniting a people. The wall comes down. The Berlin Wall stood as one of the most iconic symbols of the Cold War, a stark division between East and West, representing the ideological, political, and physical split between communist Eastern Europe and the capitalist West. For nearly 30 years, the wall separated families, cities, and entire nations, and its fall in 1989 was a pivotal moment in history, signaling not just the collapse of a wall, but the end of a divided Europe, and in many ways the end of the Cold War itself. To understand the significance of the wall's fall, one must first understand the circumstances that led to its construction in the early 1960s. After World War II, Germany was divided into two occupation zones, with the Western Allies controlling the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the Soviet Union controlling the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. Berlin, located deep within the Soviet-controlled zone, was also divided into East and West, with West Berlin being an enclave surrounded by communist East Germany. In the early post-war years, Berlin became a focal point for tensions between the superpowers, while West Germany, backed by the United States and its NATO allies, was experiencing economic growth and political stability. East Germany, under the communist regime of the Soviet Union, faced economic stagnation and political repression. The disparities between the two sides were stark. West Berlin, with its capitalist economy, was a thriving center of trade, culture, and innovation, while East Berlin, controlled by the communist government, was struggling with shortages, surveillance, and the lack of personal freedoms. The division of Berlin became more pronounced as East Germans began fleeing in large numbers to the west, seeking better opportunities and a higher quality of life. From 1949 to 1961, more than 2.5 million East Germans, nearly 20% of the population, defected to West Berlin, and from there to West Germany. This exodus of citizens was an embarrassment for the communist government, as it highlighted the failure of their political and economic system. In the face of this growing crisis, the East German government, with the support of the Soviet Union, decided to act decisively. In the early hours of August 13, 1961, the Berlin Wall was erected. The wall, constructed virtually overnight, physically and symbolically separated East Berlin from West Berlin. It was a barrier built not only to stop the flow of people, but also to assert the authority of the communist government. It was topped with barbed wire, fortified with watchtowers, and patrolled by armed guards. The wall divided families and friends, and for many, it became a daily reminder of the ideological divide between communism and capitalism. But while the Berlin Wall was intended to be a permanent division, it eventually became a symbol of repression and oppression. Over the years, as the wall stood between the two halves of the city, the people of East Berlin and East Germany lived with the knowledge that they were physically and ideologically cut off from the rest of the world. This division would last for nearly 3 decades, through the height of the Cold War, but it was never truly secure. For while the wall physically separated East from West, it also served as a constant reminder of the deep-seated tensions that existed between the two ideologies. The wall's symbolic power was undeniable. For many in the West, it represented the lack of freedom, the tyranny of the Soviet-controlled East, and the failure of the communist regime. For those in the East, the wall represented not just physical separation, but a life of surveillance, oppression, and limited opportunity. But by the late 1980s, as political winds shifted across Eastern Europe, change became inevitable. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, had begun to undergo its own transformation. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were designed to address the political and economic failures of the Soviet system. These reforms had a ripple effect across Eastern Europe, as satellite nations began to question the authority of the Soviet regime. Pro-democracy movements gained strength, and the citizens of East Germany were no longer willing to accept the status quo. In East Berlin, the pressure was building. Citizens began to demand greater freedoms, and the government's control over information began to falter. Protesters gathered in the streets calling for an end to the wall and for reunification with the West. In November 1989, in a move that shocked the world, the East German government announced that the border between East and West Berlin would be opened. The news spread quickly, and within hours, thousands of East Berliners were flocking to the wall. Guards, unprepared for the mass of people, opened the gates, allowing East Berliners to cross freely into West Berlin for the first time in nearly 3 decades. The scenes of jubilant East and West Berliners tearing down the wall, celebrating their newfound freedom, and embracing one another became an iconic image of the end of the Cold War. The wall was no longer just a physical barrier, it had become a symbol of the division and hatred between ideologies. As it came down, it also represented the collapse of the oppressive communist regime and the triumph of democracy and unity. But while the fall of the wall marked a victory for freedom, it also raised complex questions about the future of Germany, Europe, and the world. How would the reunification of Germany occur? What would be the long-term effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union? And how would the world move forward from the ideological conflict that had defined the second half of the 20th century? The fall of the Berlin Wall was not just a moment in history, it was the beginning of a new era. As the wall crumbled, so too did the divisions of the Cold War. The world began to shift, and Europe was irrevocably changed. But in the aftermath, questions lingered. What would the future hold for the citizens of East Germany, for a reunified Germany, and for the broader European and global landscape? Rebuilding and reunification While the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked a euphoric moment of reunification for millions of Germans, the process of rebuilding and reintegrating the two halves of Germany was far from simple. The wall's destruction was more than just the tearing down of concrete and steel. It was the beginning of a complicated, often painful journey toward political, social, and economic unity. The Germans who lived on either side of the wall had spent nearly 3 decades under entirely different systems, one capitalist and democratic, the other communist and authoritarian. These years of division had left deep marks on their identities, their economies, and their societies. The challenges of political reunification. Politically, reunification was a delicate and sensitive process. When the wall came down, East Germany's government quickly crumbled, as the Soviet Union's grip on Eastern Europe loosened. But the decision to merge the two Germanys was not a simple matter of knocking down the wall and declaring one unified country. The question of how to integrate East Germany into the democratic, market-driven system of West Germany was fraught with challenges. In the months following the wall's fall, the East German leadership began to collapse under the pressure of the wave of reform sweeping through Eastern Europe. In March 1990, free elections were held in East Germany for the first time in decades. The result was a clear mandate for reunification with the West, but there was no immediate agreement on how it would occur. Would it be a gradual process, or would Germany reunite quickly? What system would be implemented in the East? And how would the West deal with the economic disparities that existed between the two regions? The West German government, led by Chancellor Helmut Kohl, had its own vision of reunification. Kohl was deeply committed to bringing East Germany into the fold, but he also recognized the immense challenges it posed. He proposed that East Germany adopt the democratic structures and capitalist economy of West Germany. This was an appealing solution, especially to many in the West, but it was a harder sell to the citizens of East Germany, who had lived under a socialist government for nearly half a century. While many East Germans were eager to reunite with the West, they had concerns about the loss of their identity and the consequences of rapidly adopting the Western system. In order to facilitate reunification, the two countries entered into what became known as the 2+4 negotiations, named for the two Germanys and the four Allied powers that had occupied Germany after World War II: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. The negotiations focused on issues such as the military status of Germany, the withdrawal of foreign troops, and the restructuring of Europe in the post-Cold War world. The most significant result of these talks was the agreement that Germany would be fully reunified and allowed to maintain its full sovereignty. But the process had to be carefully managed to avoid destabilizing Europe. By October 1990, the unification process was formalized, and East and West Germany officially became one country once again. But while the political victory was clear, the real work of reunification was just beginning. The citizens of East and West Germany had to adjust to a new political system, and they had to do so amid economic, social, and cultural upheaval. Economic disparities, the struggle to integrate economies. Perhaps the most immediate challenge in reunification was the integration of the two Germany's economies. The economic systems of East and West Germany were drastically different. West Germany had a thriving market economy, one of the largest and most powerful in Europe. It was part of the European Economic Community, which would later become the European Union, and had a highly developed industrial base. East Germany, on the other hand, was a command economy under the control of the state. The economy was inefficient, riddled with corruption, and heavily dependent on subsidies from the Soviet Union. When reunification occurred, the newly merged Germany faced the difficult task of integrating East Germany's struggling economy into the highly advanced capitalist West German system. The West German government committed billions of dollars to help rebuild the East, but the process was painful. State-owned industries in the East were privatized or shut down, leading to massive unemployment. The labor market in the East was ill-prepared for the transition to a competitive market-driven system, and many people found themselves without work or skills that were applicable in the modern economy. In the early years of reunification, the economic divide between East and West was glaringly obvious. While the West boomed with prosperity, East Germany lagged behind. Unemployment in the East soared, and many people, particularly older generations, struggled to adapt to the new capitalist system. Factories closed, and the once prominent East German industry disappeared, replaced by Western consumer goods and services. Despite the enormous financial support from the West, the process of economic integration was slow, and the social tensions between East and West Germans only grew. Many in the East felt like second-class citizens, as they saw their homes, industries, and ways of life swept away by Westernization. At the same time, West Germans grew frustrated with the costs of reunification, as they felt burdened by the economic challenges of integrating the poorer East. Despite these struggles, the long-term economic success of reunification is undeniable. Over time, the East began to catch up with the West, though the process took decades. Napoleon's situation grew increasingly dire as he dealt with health problems, including what appeared to be a series of stomach ailments. He complained of pain and discomfort, and his health declined steadily throughout the final years of his life, though he was attended to by a small group of doctors. The medical care available on the island was rudimentary at best. Napoleon's symptoms worsened, and it became clear that he would not live much longer. As he faced his final days, Napoleon's thoughts turned to his legacy. His once grand vision for Europe had crumbled, and his dreams of a restored empire seemed more and more impossible. In his last years on St. Helena, he dictated his memoirs, telling the story of his life and his reign, and attempted to solidify his place in history. He was still deeply aware of his importance, not just as a military leader, but as a historical figure, and he wished to be remembered, not for his exile, but for his contributions to Europe. The irony of his exile on St. Helena was not lost on those around him. Here was a man who had once held sway over vast territories, and made history with every decision he made, now reduced to a life of confinement and suffering on a tiny island. He was both the prisoner of his past actions and a prisoner of his unyielding ambition. Despite the isolation, Napoleon never fully gave up on the idea of a grand return, but by the time of his death in 1821, it was clear that there would be no more comebacks. Napoleon died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, after a long period of ill health. His death was officially attributed to stomach cancer, though there have been many theories about the exact cause, including poisoning. His death marked the final chapter of one of the most remarkable and tragic lives in history. The emperor who had once ruled over much of Europe now lay buried on an isolated island, far from the power and glory that had defined his life. St. Helena, once the place of his exile, became the final resting place of Napoleon Bonaparte. His tomb, a small, humble structure on the island, would become a site of pilgrimage for admirers of the emperor, even though his reign and ambitions were long gone. The lasting influence of Napoleon's reign. Napoleon Bonaparte's life and reign may have ended in the isolated exile on St. Helena, but the impact of his rule has resonated through history in ways that continue to shape Europe and the world today. His empire may have collapsed, but the changes he instigated both politically and culturally were far-reaching, and his legacy has persisted well beyond his death. Napoleon's political and legal legacy. One of Napoleon's most enduring legacies is the Napoleonic Code, a set of civil laws that revolutionized legal systems not just in France but across Europe and the wider world. The Napoleonic Code, established in 1804, was one of the first comprehensive and modern legal systems to be implemented in Europe. It was based on the idea that law should be clear, accessible, and equally applied to all citizens regardless of their social status or wealth. Before Napoleon, many European countries were still governed by a patchwork of feudal laws, local customs, and church regulations, all of which could vary dramatically from one region to another. The Napoleonic Code, however, provided a uniform legal framework that guaranteed individual rights, such as property rights, the equality of citizens before the law, and the secularization of the legal system. The Napoleonic Code had a profound impact on France, where it abolished many of the old privileges of the nobility and the church. It introduced principles such as equality before the law and the protection of private property, which were radical ideas for their time. But its influence spread far beyond France. The code was adopted or adapted in many countries that had been influenced by Napoleon's conquests. Nations like Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, and parts of Germany enacted similar laws. Even countries that were not directly under Napoleon's rule, such as Japan and Latin American republics, would later adopt or be influenced by the principles of the Napoleonic Code. The creation of a modern legal framework that guaranteed the rights of individuals and protected property was one of Napoleon's most significant contributions. It shaped the legal systems of many nations and remains the foundation for civil law systems worldwide, affecting the way legal institutions function today. The spread of nationalism and modern statehood. Another significant aspect of Napoleon's legacy is the spread of nationalism and the modern concept of the nation-state. Napoleon's empire, while it was an authoritarian regime, also fostered the rise of national consciousness in many parts of Europe. His conquests brought about the unification of previously fragmented states, and in the process he encouraged the idea that people with shared cultural, linguistic, and historical ties should be united under a single government. In Italy and Germany, for example, the Napoleonic era accelerated the unification movements that would later lead to the creation of modern nation-states. Napoleon's annexation of these regions and his establishment of satellite republics in Italy and the German states laid the groundwork for the future unification of both Italy and Germany in the 19th century. Though Napoleon's empire was built on conquest, the people of these regions often adopted the idea of national identity, which persisted long after Napoleon's downfall. In addition, Napoleon's reforms in the territories he controlled promoted the idea of meritocracy, where individuals could rise to power based on their abilities, rather than their birthright. This system, which was rooted in the French Revolution's principles of equality and liberty, became a model for other European countries that sought to modernize their own bureaucracies and institutions. Napoleon's efforts to modernize the administrative systems of France and its territories left a lasting impression on European governance, with many countries adopting similar systems of centralized control and professional civil services. The impact on European politics and military strategy. Napoleon's military genius, though it ultimately led to his downfall, has remained a crucial part of military history. His ability to rapidly mobilize and organize large, disciplined armies, combined with his innovative strategies and tactics, changed the nature of warfare. The Napoleonic Wars, which raged across Europe from 1803 to 1815, demonstrated the importance of logistics, speed, and coordination in modern warfare. His campaigns emphasized the use of artillery, the importance of a well-trained and efficient army, and the need for decisive battles that could quickly turn the tide of war. Napoleon's influence on military strategy extended far beyond his own era. The tactics he employed are still studied in military academies around the world. His concept of total war, in which entire nations are mobilized for battle, as well as his emphasis on the strategic use of massed forces and rapid maneuver, influenced the development of modern armies. Even though Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo ended his reign, the military lessons from his campaigns have continued to shape the tactics of subsequent military leaders. On a broader scale, Napoleon's fall led to the reshaping of European geopolitics. After his defeat, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 attempted to restore the pre-Napoleonic order by redrawing the map of Europe and re-establishing monarchies that Napoleon had overthrown. However, the legacy of the Napoleonic era could not be undone. The political and social changes he had set in motion, particularly the spread of nationalism and the idea of the nation-state, could not be reversed. Napoleon's lasting cultural influence. Though Napoleon's reign ended in failure, his cultural impact was profound. His image as both a military hero and a tragic treasure has fascinated historians, artists, and writers for centuries. His rise to power and subsequent fall from grace created a myth that has persisted in literature, art, and popular culture. In the 19th century, many authors and artists began to romanticize Napoleon's story. Writers like Victor Hugo in Les Miserables and Stendhal in The Red and the Black examined the complex character of Napoleon, blending admiration for his achievements with criticism of his tyranny. Napoleon's figure became the subject of numerous paintings, sculptures, and songs, often portraying him as both a tragic and heroic figure. In the 20th century, Napoleon's influence remained strong. His image was used as a symbol of both tyranny and revolution, and his story continued to inspire both political movements and popular narratives. His legacy, though built on the foundation of war and conquest, was intertwined with ideals of reform, modernization, and the fight for national unity. The final reflection: Napoleon's place in history. Napoleon's life and legacy offer a fascinating example of the rise and fall of a man who shaped the course of history. Though his time as Emperor of the French was brief, his influence on Europe and the world has been enduring. The reforms he implemented, the political structures he created, and the military strategies he pioneered left a deep imprint on the modern world. However, his fall, marked by his exile to St. Helena and his death at the age of 51, serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition. Napoleon's story is one of incredible achievement and dramatic failure, a man who rose from humble beginnings to reshape Europe, only to be brought down by his own hubris and the limits of power. His legacy, though complicated, remains one of the most compelling in history. As we look back on Napoleon's life, we are left with a question: how can the lessons of his rise and fall inform our understanding of leadership, ambition, and the fragility of power in the modern world? The rise and fall of the Berlin Wall, dividing a nation, uniting a people. The wall comes down. The Berlin Wall stood as one of the most iconic symbols of the Cold War, a stark division between East and West, representing the ideological, political, and physical split between communist Eastern Europe and the capitalist West. For nearly 30 years, the wall separated families, cities, and entire nations, and its fall in 1989 was a pivotal moment in history, signaling not just the collapse of a wall, but the end of a divided Europe, and in many ways, the end of the Cold War itself. To understand the significance of the wall's fall, one must first understand the circumstances that led to its construction in the early 1960s. After World War II, Germany was divided into two occupation zones, with the Western Allies controlling the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the Soviet Union controlling the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. Berlin, located deep within the Soviet-controlled zone, was also divided into East and West, with West Berlin being an enclave surrounded by communist East Germany. In the early post-war years, Berlin became a focal point for tensions between the superpowers, while West Germany, backed by the United States and its NATO allies, was experiencing economic growth and political stability. East Germany, under the communist regime of the Soviet Union, faced economic stagnation and political repression. The disparities between the two sides were stark. West Berlin, with its capitalist economy, was a thriving center of trade, culture, and innovation, while East Berlin, controlled by the communist government, was struggling with shortages, surveillance, and the lack of personal freedoms. The division of Berlin became more pronounced as East Germans began fleeing in large numbers to the west, seeking better opportunities and a higher quality of life. From 1949 to 1961, more than 2.5 million East Germans, nearly 20% of the population, defected to West Berlin, and from there to West Germany. This exodus of citizens was an embarrassment for the communist government, as it highlighted the failure of their political and economic system. In the face of this growing crisis, the East German government, with the support of the Soviet Union, decided to act decisively. In the early hours of August 13, 1961, the Berlin Wall was erected. The wall, constructed virtually overnight, physically and symbolically separated East Berlin from West Berlin. It was a barrier built not only to stop the flow of people, but also to assert the authority of the communist government. It was topped with barbed wire, fortified with watchtowers, and patrolled by armed guards. The wall divided families and friends, and for many, it became a daily reminder of the ideological divide between communism and capitalism. But while the Berlin Wall was intended to be a permanent division, it eventually became a symbol of repression and oppression. Over the years, as the wall stood between the two halves of the city, the people of East Berlin and East Germany lived with the knowledge that they were physically and ideologically cut off from the rest of the world. This division would last for nearly 3 decades, through the height of the Cold War, but it was never truly secure. For while the wall physically separated East from West, it also served as a constant reminder of the deep-seated tensions that existed between the two ideologies. The wall's symbolic power was undeniable. For many in the West, it represented the lack of freedom, the tyranny of the Soviet-controlled East, and the failure of the communist regime. For those in the East, the wall represented not just physical separation, but a life of surveillance, oppression, and limited opportunity. But by the late 1980s, as political winds shifted across Eastern Europe, change became inevitable. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, had begun to undergo its own transformation. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring were designed to address the political and economic failures of the Soviet system. These reforms had a ripple effect across Eastern Europe, as satellite nations began to question the authority of the Soviet regime. Pro-democracy movements gained strength, and the citizens of East Germany were no longer willing to accept the status quo. In East Berlin, the pressure was building. Citizens began to demand greater freedoms, and the government's control over information began to falter. Protesters gathered in the streets, calling for an end to the wall and for reunification with the West. In November 1989, in a move that shocked the world, the East German government announced that the border between East and West Berlin would be opened. The news spread quickly, and within hours, thousands of East Berliners were flocking to the wall. Guards, unprepared for the mass of people, opened the gates, allowing East Berliners to cross freely into West Berlin for the first time in nearly 3 decades. The scenes of jubilant East and West Berliners tearing down the wall, celebrating their newfound freedom, and embracing one another became an iconic image of the end of the Cold War. The wall was no longer just a physical barrier, it had become a symbol of the division and hatred between ideologies. As it came down, it also represented the collapse of the oppressive communist regime and the triumph of democracy and unity. But while the fall of the wall marked a victory for freedom, it also raised complex questions about the future of Germany, Europe and the world. How would the reunification of Germany occur? What would be the long-term effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union? And how would the world move forward from the ideological conflict that had defined the second half of the 20th century? The fall of the Berlin Wall was not just a moment in history, it was the beginning of a new era. As the wall crumbled, so too did the divisions of the Cold War. The world began to shift, and Europe was irrevocably changed. But in the aftermath, questions lingered. What would the future hold for the citizens of East Germany, for a reunified Germany, and for the broader European and global landscape? Rebuilding and reunification. While the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked a euphoric moment of reunification for millions of Germans, the process of rebuilding and reintegrating the two halves of Germany was far from simple. The wall's destruction was more than just the tearing down of concrete and steel. It was the beginning of a complicated, often painful journey toward political, social, and economic unity. The Germans who lived on either side of the wall had spent nearly decades under entirely different systems, one capitalist and democratic, the other communist and authoritarian. These years of division had left deep marks on their identities, their economies and their societies. The challenges of political reunification. Politically, reunification was a delicate and sensitive process. When the wall came down, East Germany's government quickly crumbled, as the Soviet Union's grip on Eastern Europe loosened. But the decision to merge the two Germanys was not a simple matter of knocking down the wall and declaring one unified country. The question of how to integrate East Germany into the democratic, market-driven system of West Germany was fraught with challenges. In the months following the wall's fall, the East German leadership began to collapse under the pressure of the wave of reforms sweeping through Eastern Europe. In March 1990, free elections were held in East Germany for the first time in decades. The result was a clear mandate for reunification with the West, but there was no immediate agreement on how it would occur. Would it be a gradual process, or would Germany reunite quickly? What system would be implemented in the East? And how would the West deal with the economic disparities that existed between the two regions? The West German government, led by Chancellor Helmut Kohl, had its own vision of reunification. Kohl was deeply committed to bringing East Germany into the fold, but he also recognized the immense challenges it posed. He proposed that East Germany adopt the democratic structures and capitalist economy of West Germany. This was an appealing solution, especially to many in the West, but it was a harder sell to the citizens of East Germany, who had lived under a socialist government for nearly half a century. While many East Germans were eager to reunite with the West, they had concerns about the loss of their identity and the consequences of rapidly adopting the Western system. In order to facilitate reunification, the two countries entered into what became known as the 2+4 negotiations, named for the two Germanys and the four Allied powers that had occupied Germany after World War II: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain and France. The negotiations focused on issues such as the military status of Germany, the withdrawal of foreign troops, and the restructuring of Europe in the post-Cold War world. The most significant result of these talks was the agreement that Germany would be fully reunified and allowed to maintain its full sovereignty. but the process had to be carefully managed to avoid destabilizing Europe. By October 1990, the unification process was formalized, and East and West Germany officially became one country once again. But while the political victory was clear, the real work of reunification was just beginning. The citizens of East and West Germany had to adjust to a new political system, and they had to do so amid economic, social and cultural upheaval, economic disparities, the struggle to integrate economies. Perhaps the most immediate challenge in reunification was the integration of the two Germany's economies. The economic systems of East and West Germany were drastically different. West Germany had a thriving market economy, one of the largest and most powerful in Europe. It was part of the European Economic Community, which would later become the European Union, and had a highly developed industrial base. East Germany, on the other hand, was a command economy under the control of the state. The economy was inefficient, riddled with corruption, and heavily dependent on subsidies from the Soviet Union. When reunification occurred, the newly merged Germany faced the difficult task of integrating East Germany's struggling economy into the highly advanced capitalist West German system. The West German government committed billions of dollars to help rebuild the East, but the process was painful. State-owned industries in the East were privatized or shut down, leading to massive unemployment. The labor market in the East was ill-prepared for the transition to a competitive, market-driven system, and many people found themselves without work or skills that were applicable in the modern economy. In the early years of reunification, this economic divide between East and West was glaringly obvious. While the West boomed with prosperity, East Germany lagged behind. Unemployment in the East soared, and many people, particularly older generations, struggled to adapt to new capitalist system. Factories closed, and the once prominent East German industry disappeared, replaced by Western consumer goods and services. Despite the enormous financial support from the West, the process of economic integration was slow, and the social tensions between East and West Germans only grew. Many in the East felt like second-class citizens, as they saw their homes, industries, and ways of life swept away by westernization. At the same time, West Germans grew frustrated with the costs of reunification, as they felt burdened by the economic challenges of integrating the poorer East. Despite these struggles, the long-term economic success of reunification is undeniable. Over time, the East began to catch up with the West, though the process took decades. Led to the establishment of the International Ice Patrol, which monitored the movement of icebergs in the North Atlantic to prevent future collisions. Despite these changes, the Titanic disaster left a deep scar on the public consciousness, one that extended far beyond the world of shipping. It made people question the assumptions of the era. If mankind could build a ship that was meant to be unsinkable, how could something so human and so proud be so vulnerable? The event raised questions about the role of human ambition and whether, in the pursuit of greatness, people could overlook the basic risks that come with the unknown. The Titanic disaster also led to a deeper reflection on the limitations of technology and the responsibility of those who create it. The idea of an unsinkable ship was a concept rooted in overconfidence. While the Titanic's creators were right to celebrate its engineering marvels, they were ultimately undone by a series of oversights that proved the fallibility of human designs. The disaster served as a reminder that even the most impressive achievements are vulnerable to failure when not approached with humility, caution, and foresight. The Titanic in popular culture. Over the years, the Titanic's legacy has become deeply ingrained in popular culture. The story of the ship's ill-fated voyage, the loss of life, and the subsequent investigations have been told and retold in countless books, films, and documentaries. Perhaps the most famous retelling of the Titanic story came with James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic, which depicted the disaster and its aftermath in vivid detail. The film was a massive cultural phenomenon and brought the Titanic tragedy to a new generation of viewers, once again highlighting the universal themes of love, loss, and the perils of hubris. The film's success helped reignite public interest in the Titanic, leading to renewed efforts to discover the ship's final resting place. In 1985, an expedition led by oceanographer Robert Ballard located the wreck of the Titanic at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, nearly 12,500 feet below the surface. The discovery of the wreckage confirmed that the ship had indeed sunk to the ocean floor in two large sections, with the bow and stern resting some distance apart. Since then, numerous dives and expeditions have been launched to study the wreck, and many artifacts have been recovered from the site. The Titanic's wreck, which is now seen as a sacred site for many, serves as a poignant reminder of the human cost of the disaster. The wreck continues to deteriorate as salt water and bacteria accelerate its decay, but it remains one of the most famous and most visited shipwrecks in history. The enduring legacy of the Titanic. The Titanic disaster remains one of the most enduring and emotional stories of the 20th century. While its sinking was a tragic event that cost over 1,500 lives, the legacy of the Titanic goes beyond the loss of the ship itself. It serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of overconfidence, the limitations of technology, and the value of humility. The disaster also spurred critical reforms in maritime safety, ensuring that future generations would not face the same fate. In the years since, the Titanic has come to symbolize both the heights of human ambition and the depths of human frailty. It is a story of triumph and failure, of human ingenuity and its consequence. The Titanic's legacy continues to inspire fascination, remembrance, and reflection, reminding us that even the greatest achievements are not immune to failure, and that the pursuit of greatness must always be tempered with caution and respect for the forces beyond our control. The Great Chicago Fire, rebuilding a city from ashes. The spark of destruction. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 is a story of destruction, but it is also a story of resilience and rebirth. In the space of just 24 hours, a thriving city known for its bustling economy, thriving industries and rapid expansion was nearly leveled. The fire that began on the evening of October 1871 would destroy much of Chicago, but the events surrounding the fire and its aftermath would ultimately transform the city and the nation. To understand the significance of the Great Chicago Fire, one must first consider the city before it became a victim of such a devastating disaster. In the years leading up to the fire, Chicago was one of the fastest-growing cities in America. Its strategic location along Lake Michigan, combined with the completion of the Illinois and Michigan Canal and the expansion of the railroad network, made it a transportation hub and a center of commerce. By 1871, Chicago was home to over 300,000 people and was a booming industrial city, known for its meat-packing plants, steel mills and factories. The city was full of energy, ambition and development, with new buildings, businesses and neighborhoods springing up every year. But while the city flourished, it also had a dangerous vulnerability: fire. Chicago's rapid expansion had resulted in a densely packed city, filled with wooden buildings and structures that were often built too close together. Many of the city's early buildings were constructed with wood and other highly flammable materials, and the city's firefighting resources were stretched thin. By the time the fire broke out, Chicago had already experienced several smaller fires, but none were on the scale of what was about to come. On the night of October 1871, the fire began in a small barn located in the southwestern part of the city, belonging to the O'Leary family. The origins of the fire remain unclear, and various theories abound, including the famous but unproven story of Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern, igniting the hay in the barn. Whatever the cause, the fire spread quickly due to the dry conditions and the wind that whipped through the city. Within hours, it was out of control, and there was little that the city's fire brigade could do to stop it. The fire was fed by the dense wooden structures, the intense heat, and the lack of proper water supply, which hampered efforts to douse the flames. Buildings caught fire almost instantly, and entire blocks of the city were consumed. What began as a small fire in a barn grew into an inferno that destroyed much of downtown Chicago. The fire raged on through the night and into the next day, with the flames reaching as far as the northern and southern districts of the city. By the time the fire was finally brought under control on October 10, it had devastated nearly 3.3 square miles of the city, leaving more than 100,000 people homeless and destroying thousands of buildings, including homes, businesses, churches, and schools. The fire killed at least 250 people and caused damages estimated at around $200 million, equivalent to billions of dollars today. Chicago was in ruins, and the future of the city seemed uncertain. As the fire was finally contained, the residents of Chicago were left to face the enormity of the destruction. Yet even in the face of such a catastrophe, the spirit of the city's people remained unbroken. In the aftermath of the Great Chicago Fire, a remarkable transformation began, one that would rebuild the city from the ashes and turn Chicago into a symbol of resilience and ambition. But how did a city that had been reduced to rubble rebuild itself so quickly? What drove the people of Chicago to rise from the ashes and create one of the world's greatest cities? The answers lie not just in the physical rebuilding of structures, but in the collective will of the city's inhabitants and the lessons they learned from the fire's devastation rising from the ashes. In the wake of the Great Chicago Fire, the city faced an overwhelming task, rebuilding not just its buildings and infrastructure, but also its economy, reputation and morale. The destruction of October 1871 left more than 100,000 people homeless, with many families losing everything they owned. Yet even in the face of such devastation, the people of Chicago showed remarkable resilience. The city's ability to recover and rebuild so quickly became a testament to the determination, ambition and ingenuity that had characterized Chicago's rapid rise in the previous decades. The immediate response, survival and relief efforts. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, the priority was survival and providing relief to the displaced population. The city was a chaotic scene, with homes and businesses reduced to ash, and survivors in desperate need of shelter, food and medical care. The people of Chicago, however, wasted no time in mobilizing relief efforts. Volunteer organizations sprang up to assist with the recovery process, providing food and medical supplies to those affected. Churches and schools were converted into temporary shelters for the displaced. Despite the destruction, the community's sense of unity and determination began to shine through. The city's business leaders, many of whom had lost everything in the fire, were quick to rally, determined not to let the disaster define the future of Chicago. This spirit of cooperation and shared purpose would prove to be one of the driving forces behind the city's recovery. Chicago also received help from across the United States and abroad. Donations of money, goods and supplies poured in from cities around the country, and even international aid came from as far as Europe. The fire, though devastating, revealed the strength of the national and international support networks that would prove critical in the rebuilding process. In just weeks, makeshift shelters were replaced with temporary structures, and the effort to get the city's basic services up and running began. Rebuilding the infrastructure, ambition and innovation. Once immediate relief efforts had stabilized the city, the focus shifted to rebuilding. However, unlike other cities that might have rebuilt their structures in a similar style to what had been lost, Chicago's leadership made a deliberate decision to create something new, something modern. The city's rapid growth, combined with the fire's destruction, presented an opportunity to rethink the way buildings were designed, constructed, and protected from future disasters. One of the first steps in this process was the creation of fireproof structures. The city had learned the painful lesson that wooden buildings which had dominated the city's landscape were far too vulnerable to fire. As a result, architects and engineers began to design buildings made from brick, stone and steel materials that were less likely to catch fire and would provide a more solid foundation for a growing city. The idea of using steel in construction was still relatively new at the time, but the fire served as a catalyst for its widespread adoption. Steel framing, which would later come to define the modern skyscraper, was incorporated into many of the city's new buildings. The use of steel allowed for taller, more durable structures, while brick and stone provided added stability. The Chicago School of Architecture, a movement that emerged in the wake of the fire, was instrumental in shaping the city's new skyline. Architects like Louis Sullivan and Daniel Burnham would go on to design some of the most iconic buildings in Chicago, including the famous Wrigley Building and the Chicago Auditorium. The city also began to install modern infrastructure that could better withstand future disasters. Water systems were upgraded, and new fire departments were created, equipped with better firefighting tools and resources. The rebuilding process was not just about physical structures. It was about creating a more resilient and forward-thinking city that could handle the challenges of the modern world. The rise of the skyscraper, a symbol of resilience. Perhaps the most significant change to the city's landscape after the fire was the rise of the skyscraper. Chicago would come to be known as the birthplace of the modern skyscraper, and the fire played a key role in this development. With the city's downtown area reduced to rubble, there was plenty of space for new, taller buildings to rise in its place. The rebuilding effort saw the construction of high-rise buildings that were not only fireproof but also more functional and efficient than the structures that had preceded them. The first true skyscraper to be built in Chicago was the Home Insurance Building, completed in designed by architect William LeBaron Jenney. The Home Insurance Building was the first building to feature a steel frame, which allowed it to rise to 10 stories, unprecedented at the time. This innovation in building technology would pave the way for even taller structures to be constructed in the years to come. By the end of the 19th century, Chicago was home to some of the world's tallest and most impressive buildings. The city's skyline became a symbol of American industrial power and ingenuity. The Chicago School of Architecture, led by figures such as Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Burnham, revolutionized architectural design, emphasizing the use of modern materials like steel and glass. These buildings became a symbol of both Chicago's recovery and its future, strong, resilient, and ever-reaching for the sky. Cultural rebirth and international recognition. The physical rebuilding of the city was only part of the story. The Great Chicago Fire also sparked a cultural rebirth. The city, which had once been seen as just a fast-growing industrial hub, began to gain international recognition as a center of innovation, design, and culture. In 1893, Chicago hosted the world's Columbian Exposition, a grand international fair that celebrated the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. The fair was held in Jackson Park and became a showcase for the new, rebuilt Chicago. The exposition's architecture, designed by some of the leading architects of the time, further cemented Chicago's place as a city of modernity and progress. The world's Columbian Exposition introduced the world to Chicago's cultural and technological advancements, featuring exhibits on electricity, transportation, and architecture. The White City, as the fairgrounds were known, was a temporary but dazzling display of neoclassical architecture, and it showcased the city's ability to rise from the ashes of the fire and create something beautiful and forward-thinking. At the same time, Chicago's cultural scene began to thrive. The city became home to institutions like the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Field Museum of Natural History, which would go on to play major roles in the development of American arts and culture. The fire in many ways had stripped the city of its old identity, but it also allowed Chicago to reinvent itself and become a world leader in culture, business, and innovation. A city transformed. The enduring spirit of Chicago. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 was a tragedy that left the city in ruins, but it also became the catalyst for one of the most remarkable stories of recovery and transformation in American history. The fire revealed the vulnerabilities of the city, but also the remarkable resilience of its people. From the ashes of destruction, Chicago rebuilt itself stronger, taller, and more ambitious than ever before. Today, Chicago stands as a symbol of perseverance. Its skyline is filled with towering skyscrapers, and its economy is one of the largest and most diverse in the world. The spirit of the city, the determination to rebuild, to innovate, and to overcome challenges has never wavered. The lessons learned from the fire shaped the city's approach to urban planning, architecture, and resilience, and they continue to inspire future generations of Chicago. In the end, the Great Chicago Fire may have destroyed much of the city, but it also sparked a transformation that allowed Chicago to emerge as a global leader. The fire, like so many challenges in life, was a turning point, and from it emerged a city that would forever stand as a testament to the power of human ambition and resilience.